Hey there, Night Wanderer. If today wore you out even a little, you found the right place to land. Get cozy, because tonight we're going somewhere far older than anything either of us has ever stood on. Somewhere in the south of France, under a shelf of pale limestone, a man once knelt in the dirt with nothing but a small brush in his hand, and found a piece of bone that should not have existed. Not that shape, not in that layer of earth. What he was about to uncover would end up forcing scientists to rethink one of the last great chapters of the Neanderthal story. And somehow it all began with a broken jaw hidden inside a quiet cave waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. Before we step inside that cave together, let me ask one small thing of you. If stories like this one settle your mind the way they settle mine, go ahead and tap that like button. Hit subscribe and leave a comment down below. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you want more nights exactly like this one. And while you are down there, tell me where you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you're sitting right now. I always love picturing where these stories land, one quiet room at a time. Now go ahead and turn the lights down low. Maybe click on a fan or something soft humming in the background. Get yourself settled in under a blanket if you have one nearby. This one is worth staying awake a little longer for. It is the year 2015 in a narrow gorge above the Rhone River in the south of France. The gorge is called Grotte Mandarin, and if you saw it from the road above you might drive right past it without a second look. A shallow mouth of pale stone half hidden behind wild grass and thorn bushes, cut into a cliff no taller than a house. Lavender grows somewhere nearby, and in the warmer months the whole valley smells faintly sweet, almost lazy the way certain corners of the French countryside do. Nothing about the view looks like the beginning of anything important. Outside, somewhere above the cliff, cicadas are keeping up their steady summer chorus, the kind of sound that never quite stops in the south of France once the warm months settle in. A soft breeze moves through the grass at the entrance, carrying a little dust with it. It is in almost every way a completely unremarkable morning, but step past the entrance and the air changes, cooler, older, the kind of quiet that makes you lower your voice without meaning to, as though the stone itself is still listening. A man is kneeling near the back wall exactly where he has knelt on and off for more years than most people spend at any single job. His name is Ludovic Slimak, and by this point in his life this cave is less a workplace and more something akin to a long, difficult friendship. The kind where you keep showing up year after year, not entirely sure why, except that some part of you refuses to leave the conversation unfinished. Now, Archaeology, if you have never tried it, does not look anything like the movies. There is no swelling music, no torchlight, no golden idol resting on a pedestal, guarded by a suspiciously convenient trap. Mostly there is dust in your eyes, an ache in your knees by lunchtime, and long hours spent staring at soil that looks to absolutely everyone else on Earth like soil. Every fragment gets a number instead of a name, and gets sealed inside a small plastic bag, which is roughly as thrilling as it sounds, right up until the moment you remember what might be resting inside one of those bags. Slimak has given a good part of his working life to this exact patch of ground. He first started digging in this valley as a much younger man, full of the kind of certainty you only carry before the world has had a chance to complicate it for you. And somewhere along the way, in the middle of all that patient, unglamorous labour, he picked up a small, stubborn suspicion that most of his colleagues did not share. It started with stone tools. Years before this particular morning, earlier digs at Grotte Mandarin had turned up flint tools with a strange, almost foreign character to them, a style that did not quite match anything found nearby in any of the neighbouring valleys. To most researchers, a stone tool is simply a stone tool shaped by hands that all belong to more or less the same story. But to someone who has spent 20 years studying the small differences between one ancient hand and another, those tools whispered something else entirely. They suggested that whoever shaped them did not belong to the story everyone assumed they belonged to. A different rhythm in the chipping, a different choice in the angle of the strike. Small things. The kind of thing most people would walk straight past without noticing at all. Slimak noticed. And for 2 decades that small uncomfortable observation sat quietly in the back of his mind, waiting for evidence patient enough to prove it right. Grotta Mandarin, as it turns out, is not just one cave. It is dozens of thin layers of time pressed one on top of another, like the pages of a very old, very patient book that nobody has fully opened yet. Different groups of people, different seasons, tens of thousands of years apart from one another, all folded into just a few meters of earth. Peel back one layer carefully enough, and you're not simply moving downward through soil. You're moving backward through entire lifetimes that ended long before anyone thought to write anything down. And somewhere inside one of those pages Slimak believed sat proof of something no one had ever fully documented before. Grotta Mandarin was not new to him, and it was not new to science either. Other archaeologists had passed through this same gorge for years before Slimak arrived, and a few had stayed on with him season after season, funding always a little thin progress, always a little slow. That is the part nobody tells you about discoveries like the one about to happen here. Long before any cameras, before any headlines, there is simply a small group of tired, dedicated people returning to the same hillside every warm season, digging by hand through soil that gives up its secrets only a few centimeters at a time. Some years bring almost nothing worth mentioning. This particular year would turn out to be different. On this particular morning, his team is working carefully near a layer that has already produced a handful of small fragments. A piece of tooth here, a scattered bone there, the kind of remains that usually raise far more questions than they answer. The work moves slowly on purpose. Every inch of soil gets studied before it gets removed, brushed away in careful layers, because one careless hand can destroy in a single second what nature spent 50,000 years quietly protecting. Somebody nearby is humming off key to fill the silence. Someone else is complaining, not for the first time that week, about their knees. It is in almost every way an ordinary morning of ordinary exhausting work, and then quietly, without any drama at all, a shape appears beneath the brush that should not be there. It is a fragment of jaw, heavy with soil, worn smooth by time, but unmistakably, undeniably real. Not a tool, not the bone of some long-vanished animal that once wandered this same valley. Something that once sat inside a living, breathing face. Something that once held teeth that chewed and a mouth that at some point must have opened to speak or laugh or cry out in the dark. For a moment nobody says a word. You have to understand, moments like this rarely announce themselves the way they do in films. There is no gasp, no shout, no dramatic hush, falling gently over a room full of onlookers. Mostly it is one tired, dust-covered person, kneeling alone in the dirt on an unremarkable Tuesday, staring at a piece of bone roughly the size of a house key, feeling something shift quietly and permanently inside their chest. Slimak does not know yet whose face that jaw once belonged to. He does not know if it was a hunter, a mother, an elder, or a child. He does not know how this person laughed, or what frightened them in the dark, or who they missed on the long, cold nights spent in this same valley tens of thousands of years earlier. All he has in this moment is a fragment, small, silent, and older than almost anything human hands had ever gently held before. And maybe that is the part of this story that reaches you fastest before any of the science even arrives. Somewhere behind that small piece of bone was a whole person, complete with a childhood, a family favourite, places to sit quiet, worries they never spoke out loud. We tend to imagine ancient people as distant, almost unreal, more myth than family. But whoever this was, they once stood in this same valley, felt the same cold morning air against their skin, and loved someone enough to grieve when that someone was gone. History has a strange way of shrinking people down into fragments and footnotes. Slimak kneeling there in the dirt is quietly about to spend the next 9 years trying to give one of them their story back. But something about that small piece of jaw will not let him look away, because this fragment is sitting in the wrong layer. It does not belong to the timeline he was taught to expect back when he first started digging here as a much younger man, certain of so many things he was about to become far less certain of. A quiet, persistent thought begins forming in the back of his mind, one careful piece at a time. The same thought the stone tools had already been whispering to him for 20 years. Only now it has a face, or at least the beginning of one. It will take him 9 more long years of slow, painstaking, careful work to fully prove what that thought is trying to tell him. The team photographs the fragment exactly where it lies before anyone dares to touch it. They measure it, sketch its position, note the depth, the angle, the surrounding soil with the same careful patience you might use handling something borrowed from someone you deeply respect. Only then does it get lifted gently and placed inside a small plastic bag. No name yet, only a number and a quiet sense shared silently between everyone kneeling in that cave that something important has just happened. The scientist working this site will not have a name for this person for months. Maybe not even for a couple of years. Right now, this fragment of jaw is simply a mystery, folded into soil resting patiently inside a small plastic bag, waiting its turn in a laboratory somewhere far from this valley. And that wait would end up being far longer and far stranger than anyone kneeling in that cave could have guessed. More teeth would surface in the seasons that followed, then a portion of skull, then more still, each fragment carried carefully out of the gorge and handed over to specialists who spend their entire careers coaxing fragile ancient genetic material out of bone that has spent tens of thousands of years quietly falling apart. It is slow, careful, occasionally heartbreaking work, the kind where a single contaminated sample can undo months of effort in an instant. Nobody rushes this part. Nobody dares to, but before we can understand who this person truly was, and trust me, what they eventually uncover about him will unsettle even the most seasoned scientists in this field. We need to understand something else first. We need to understand the cave itself, and why Slimak kept returning to it year after year, long before he had any proof at all that his stubborn hunch was worth the trouble. Because Grotta Mandrin was never just a hiding place tucked into a hillside. It was something closer to a witness, a quiet stone-walled witness that had already watched far more of the human story unfold within its shadows than anyone kneeling inside it that ordinary Tuesday morning could possibly imagine. Somewhere beneath that cliff face in layers still untouched by any brush or trowel, other stories were waiting too. Stories about who else had ever sheltered in this exact spot, long before this fragment of jaw was ever left behind. Some of those stories would turn out to belong to people almost unimaginably different from the person Slimak had just found. And once those layers finally opened up, the quiet gorge above the Rhone River would stop looking like an ordinary cave entirely and start looking like something closer to a crossroads. One that no scientist walking in that morning could have possibly predicted, and that is exactly where we go next. Let's rewind for a moment. Not all the way back to that jawbone in the dirt, but far enough to answer the question we left hanging in the air. Why did that cave matter so much long before anyone knew a man later nicknamed Thorin had ever set foot inside it? The answer starts of all places with a highwayman. In the early 1960s, a local explorer named Gaston Etienne pushed his way into that same shallow opening in the cliff, brushing aside the wild grass ducking under a low stone ceiling that forced him to bend nearly in half. He'd heard old stories about a smuggler from the 1700s, a rebel with a reputation as sharp as any blade said to have hidden weapons and stolen goods in caves scattered across this region. His name was Louis Mandre, and in his own strange way, he deserves a moment of your attention, because his story tells you something important about how easily legend and fact get tangled together over time. Mandrin was young, magnetic, and furious at a tax system that squeezed ordinary families dry, while a private company grew wealthy collecting duties on salt and tobacco. So he built a small army of smugglers rode through towns handing out discounted goods that undercut the crown's tax collectors, and became something of a folk hero, a kind of French answer to Robin Hood, adored by common people, and feared by the officials he humiliated again and again. His freedom did not last. He was betrayed by 2 of his own men, captured and put to death in the nearby city of Valence in the year 1755 at only 30 years old, and yet his name outlived him by centuries attached to cave after cave across this part of France, whether he ever actually set foot inside them or not. Here is the twist worth sitting with for a second. There is no solid proof that Louis Mandrin ever hid inside this particular cave. Gaston Etienne simply believed he might have based on local rumour, and the name stuck anyway. So this place carries the borrowed name of a legend that may not even be true. Resting directly above a truth so much older and so much stranger that the outlaw story almost shrinks in comparison once you understand what else is buried there, because underneath that borrowed name sits one of the most extraordinary stretches of layered earth ever excavated on this continent. Picture for a moment a cake with far too many layers to count, except each layer was not baked in an afternoon. Each one took thousands of years to settle, one slow season at a time, one fire, one shared meal, one night's shelter after another, pressed quietly down under the weight of everything that came afterward. Archaeologists working this site have traced the sequence back well over 80,000 years, with some of the deepest, oldest layers reaching past 120,000 years, all the way up to around 42,000 years ago, near the final chapter of the Neanderthals in this part of the world. Digging through something like that is nothing like the quick, dramatic reveal you might picture. Researchers spend entire seasons removing soil in slices thinner than a fingernail, cataloguing every shift in colour, every trace of ash from an ancient fire, every scattered bone fragment, because a single careless afternoon can blur together evidence separated by thousands of years. It is slow, humbling work. And it is exactly that patience that eventually cracked open one of the strangest findings in recent Neanderthal research. Recent survey work at the site has also revealed something researchers did not fully appreciate at first. This cave is far larger than anyone originally assumed. Later excavation seasons uncovered dense archaeological material spreading out across an area larger than 1,000 square meters, reaching well beyond the entrance and deep into ground nobody had thought to search carefully before. In other words, everything we're about to discuss together is only a portion of what this single hillside is quietly still holding on to. For a long time, the popular version of the human story went something like this. Neanderthals occupied Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. Then at some point, modern humans arrived from Africa, and within a relatively short and rather dramatic stretch of time, Neanderthals vanished for good. One group in, one group out, almost like a changing of the guard. Simple, tidy, easy to fit into a single sentence for a textbook. Grotta Mandrin quietly dismantles that tidy sentence one layer at a time, because buried in one particular level sandwiched between older Neanderthal remains below, and younger Neanderthal remains above, researchers found something that should not have been there at all. A single tooth. A child's molar. Unmistakably belonging to a modern human, not a Neanderthal. dated to somewhere between 56,800 and 51,700 years ago. In plain terms, somewhere around 54,000 years ago. Take a moment with that number because it matters more than it sounds like it should. Before this discovery, most researchers believed modern humans had not reached this part of Europe until somewhere closer to 43 or 45,000 years ago. This one small tooth pushed that timeline back by roughly 10,000 years. 10,000 years folded quietly into a single layer of dirt waiting for someone patient enough to notice it, and I keep coming back to the fact that it was a child's tooth, not a fully grown adult, a young one. Which means somewhere in that small travelling group someone was caring for a child in completely unfamiliar territory, likely thousands of miles from wherever their ancestors had called home. Think about that for a moment, the way you might think about your own family on a long journey to somewhere new. Packing what little you can carry, watching over a small child through cold nights in strange terrain, surrounded by unfamiliar animal calls, unfamiliar plants, maybe even unfamiliar people not so far away. Migration is often described in scientific papers using cold clinical language arrows on a map, dates on a chart. But underneath all of that language was a parent keeping a child near through the dark in a landscape that belonged as far as they knew entirely to someone else. The tools found beside that tooth told an even stranger part of the story. They did not resemble anything typically found in Europe from that period. Instead, their style matched artifacts almost precisely uncovered thousands of miles away at a site in present-day Lebanon. Some researchers now believe this small group of modern humans may have journeyed out of the region we now call the Near East, carrying their tool-making traditions with them all the way into the heart of what had been until that point entirely Neanderthal territory. But here is the truly strange part. It is not simply that modern humans arrived earlier than anyone thought. It is what happened right afterward. They did not stay. Based on how quickly that particular layer built up, researchers believe this small group of modern humans remained in that cave for somewhere around 40 years. One human lifetime, maybe two if you're generous with the count. And then just as quietly as they had appeared, they were gone. And Neanderthals moved back in, occupying that same stretch of stone for another 12,000 years afterward, almost as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Nobody knows exactly why they left. Maybe the group was simply too small to sustain itself for long generation after generation without new arrivals joining them. Maybe a shift in climate pushed them elsewhere in search of easier hunting grounds along the coast. Maybe, and this is the theory I find quietly haunting, they were slowly absorbed into a larger, wider population somewhere beyond this valley, their descendants surviving on, just not here. Not in any way this particular cave could ever preserve for us to find. What we do know is that this was not an isolated coincidence. Once researchers began mapping the full sequence at Grotta Mandarin layer by careful layer, a pattern started to emerge that looked less like a single crossing of paths and more like a slow, repeating rhythm. Neanderthals settled here, left for reasons of their own. Modern humans briefly moved in behind them, left in turn, and Neanderthals returned once more, reclaiming the same stretch of stone as though it had always belonged to them, which, for the vast majority of those 80,000 years, it truly had. This place functioned almost like a rest stop shared unknowingly between two different kinds of people, separated sometimes by only a handful of years, each unaware of exactly who had rested there just before them. Sit with that image for a moment. A whole different way of surviving a whole different technology. A whole different rhythm of daily life existing inside that cave for less time than most of us spend in our current homes. Before the older, more familiar rhythm quietly returned and carried on as though the visitors had barely left a mark. Except they did leave a mark, a remarkably specific one. Buried in that same brief layer, researchers uncovered more than 1,000 tiny stone points, some of them so small they would practically disappear beside a coin from your pocket. At first glance, these looked almost too delicate to matter, almost fragile. But fragile turned out to be exactly the wrong word. When scientists reconstructed these points using the same type of stone, fitted them onto arrows, and fired them from a bow during controlled testing on animal remains, the results were hard to argue with. The arrows did not simply wound, they passed cleanly through. Meanwhile, spears thrown the way Neanderthals built and used their weapons often failed to even break the skin on the very same target. I want to slow down on that comparison because it says something quietly striking about two very different ways of surviving inside the same valley. Neanderthals, as far as every scrap of evidence shows us, never developed the bow. Their weapons were heavier, meant for short-range combat thrust, or thrown by a strong arm from a short distance, which meant getting near enough to a bison or a wild horse to truly risk your own life every single time you hunted. Modern humans, on the other hand, arrived in this valley already carrying real precision at a distance, a way to strike from farther away with less risk, more accuracy, and far less exposure to danger with every single hunt. This, by the way, stands as the earliest solid evidence of bow and arrow technology found anywhere on this continent, pushing the known history of archery in Europe back by roughly 40,000 years compared to what had previously been documented. 40,000 years. Not a small correction to a footnote, an entirely new chapter hiding quietly inside a layer barely a few inches thick. Now let me be honest with you about something rather than wrapping this up in a tidy little bow of a conclusion pun fully intended. It is tempting to look at all this and declare that the bow and arrow single-handedly explains why Neanderthals eventually disappeared from Europe. Plenty of headlines have leaned hard into exactly that idea. But the story sitting inside this cave argues for something more complicated and honestly far more interesting. If modern humans really did hold that kind of advantage, why did they leave after only a few decades? Why did Neanderthals comfortably return and continue occupying that exact same spot for another 12,000 years afterward, seemingly undisturbed? My own take on it, for whatever it happens to be worth, is this. We love simple stories about winners and losers, about one clever species outsmarting another and claiming the prize outright. It flatters us. It makes our own existence feel inevitable, almost destined, like the ending was written from the very beginning. But Grotta Mandrin does not play out like a story about certain winners. It plays out more like a story about two entirely different populations circling the same small patch of shelter for tens of thousands of years, each one leaving, returning, adapting, surviving in their own particular way. Neither one holding the outcome quite as firmly in their hands as we like to imagine when we look backward from where we stand now. If there is one thing worth carrying with you from this part of the story before we go any further, it might be this: extinction. When you look at it carefully enough, rarely happens the way we picture it happening. It is not usually a single dramatic battle or one clean moment where an old way of life simply stops and a new one begins. It is closer to this. Countless small decisions made across thousands of years by countless small groups of people who had no idea they were living through anything historic at all. They were simply trying to find food, shelter, and safety for the people they loved one uncertain season at a time, which raises a question worth sitting with while the rest of this story continues to unfold. If modern humans and Neanderthals really did take turns occupying the exact same handful of square meters, sometimes only years apart from one another, how near did they actually come to meeting face to face? Did anyone from either group ever stand at that cave entrance and notice signs that someone very different had passed through recently, a tool shaped strangely? Ash from a fire built in an unfamiliar way, a footprint the wrong size in the wrong shape in the mud near the entrance. We may never fully know the answer, but it is hard not to wonder, especially late at night in a quiet room like this one. Here is where all of this circles back to the man we started with. Thorin's fragment did not come from that brief 40-year window of modern human presence. His remains rest deeper inside the story of this valley, tied to the long, complicated, repeating rhythm of Neanderthal life that stretched across this cave for tens of thousands of years, both before and after that one short visit from strangers, which meant that whatever Slimak was slowly starting to suspect about the man in the dirt had nothing to do with modern humans arriving at all. It had to do with something happening entirely within the Neanderthals themselves, a quiet difference hiding inside their own family tree that nobody had thought to look carefully enough for before. Not a difference in tools left behind by outsiders, a difference belonging entirely to people who had already called this valley home for longer than most of us can comfortably imagine. So here is a question worth carrying with you as we move forward together. If two completely different species could pass through the exact same handful of square meters, sometimes only years apart, and still remain almost entirely invisible to one another in the archaeological record, how easily might an entire population of Neanderthals stay hidden from their own relatives living nearby for tens of thousands of years without anyone ever noticing at all? That question sat quietly in Slimak's mind for 2 full decades before he ever had the tools to answer it properly. And to understand exactly what finally convinced him he was right, we need to go back to those stone tools I mentioned earlier, look at them far more carefully than anyone bothered to the first time around, and follow the strange patient trail that eventually led him to Thorin's door. So let's go back further than any of the bones we've talked about so far. Back before the jawbone. Back before anyone had ever heard the word Thorin at all. Let's go back to 1998. That year, a much younger Ludovic Slimak walked into the Rhone Valley for the first time as a working archaeologist, and by his own account, he had absolutely no idea what he was walking into. He simply started digging the way most careers in this field quietly begin, with more curiosity than certainty. Picture it for a second. No dramatic music, no mentor pulling him aside to whisper that greatness awaited. Just a young researcher with a notebook, a trowel worn smooth from use, and the kind of stubborn optimism you only really carry in your 20s before life has had enough chances to wear it down. Most days probably look the same. Wake early, drive out to the valley, kneel in soil that had already been picked through by someone else the season before, find a few flint flakes, an animal bone, maybe a scorched patch of earth from a fire lit longer ago than written history itself. Log it. Repeat. What nobody tells you about archaeology, and what I think deserves far more credit than it usually gets, is just how much of it is built entirely out of patience and disappointment. Slimak spent the next 17 years working that same stretch of the valley season after season, mostly finding tools, ash and animal bone, and almost nothing resembling a human face. 17 years. Long enough to raise a child from birth into adulthood spent quietly scraping at soil that gave almost nothing back. If you had told him somewhere around the year 2000 that he was slowly building the foundation for one of the strangest discoveries in the history of his field, he probably would have laughed. Because at that point all he really had were rocks. But not just any rocks. Here is something worth understanding about ancient stone tools, because it changes the way you look at every flint fragment sitting quietly behind glass in a museum case. A stone tool is not just a sharp object someone happened to make. It carries a kind of signature passed down the way a recipe or an accent gets passed down from a skilled hand to an apprentice's hand generation after generation. Small choices repeat themselves. The angle of a strike, the order of removing flakes, where a toolmaker chooses to start and where they choose to stop. Change one of those tiny habits, an archaeologist can often trace exactly when and roughly where that shift first took hold. Across much of Neanderthal Europe during this broad stretch of time, those habits were shifting. New techniques appeared, sharper points, more efficient methods of hafting a blade onto a handle, small innovations spreading slowly from one community to a neighbouring one, the same way a useful trick might spread between hunters who occasionally cross paths at a river or a shared hunting ground. In parts of Central Europe and along the Atlantic coastline, researchers can actually watch these small improvements ripple outward across the landscape over the centuries, community by community, almost like a rumour travelling gradually from one town to the next, until eventually everyone in the region is doing something just slightly differently than their grandparents once did. In the Rhone Valley, none of that seemed to be happening. The tools coming out of the layers Slemac kept excavating looked generation after generation remarkably similar to the layers below them. Not identical, but similar. Stubbornly similar. As though whoever had made a home in that cave simply was not receiving the same updates everyone else around them appeared to be getting. Now you have to remember, this cave already had a name for the layer left behind by the small group of modern humans who passed through so briefly the one we talked about a moment ago. Researchers called that layer the Neronian. And when Neanderthals moved back into the cave afterward, continuing on with their own familiar way of shaping stone, researchers eventually needed a name for that tradition too. They settled on something almost poetically plain. They called it post-Neronian, meaning quite simply whatever came next, whatever picked up where the visitors had left off. And the particular phase of that tradition most directly tied to the man we now call Thorin earned its own smaller label within that larger one referred to in research papers as post-Neronian too. There is something almost fitting about that name if you sit with it for a second. The very same cave that briefly welcomed strangers carrying an entirely new way of hunting went right back almost immediately afterward to doing things exactly the way it always had. As though the door had opened for a moment and then quietly, deliberately shut itself again. Here is the detail that stopped me cold the first time I went through this research myself. That specific tool-making tradition, post-Neronian 2, shows up consistently across 4 separate excavation levels at this site, spanning roughly 10,000 years. 10,000 years of the same style, the same habits, the same small telltale choices in how stone gets shaped, repeated by hand after hand after hand, without any of the gradual drift you would expect from a community trading ideas with its neighbours. Picture your own family recipe box passed down without a single substitution, without a single added ingredient for 400 consecutive generations. That is roughly the scale of consistency researchers are describing here. Now ask yourself, honestly, when was the last time you or anyone in your own life did the exact same thing, the exact same way for even a single decade without ever picking up a shortcut, a trend, or a better idea from someone nearby? That is how unusual this pattern really is. To most archaeologists working elsewhere in Europe, that kind of unbroken sameness would eventually stand out as unusual on its own. But Slemac, digging in this one specific valley for years on end, started to notice something even more telling sitting quietly alongside it. No foreign materials, no imported styles borrowed from neighbouring regions, no obsidian, no distinctive stone types known to come from beyond the valley, no obvious sign that these particular toolmakers were exchanging anything with anyone from outside their own small world. Compare that to other Neanderthal sites across the continent, where archaeologists regularly find raw materials that clearly travelled long distances, carried by hand from one group to another, evidence of a wider social web stretching across the landscape. Here in this one valley, that web seemed to simply stop at its own edges again and again, layer after layer, for thousands of years running. In plain terms, long before anyone could prove it with genetics, the stones themselves were quietly suggesting isolation. Now I want to pause here and give you a small warning because this next part matters. Reading ancient tool styles is far trickier than people often assume, and archaeology has been embarrassed by overconfidence before. For decades, one particular tool-making tradition found across parts of France called the Châtelperronian was confidently attributed to late Neanderthals, treated almost as proof that they were independently developing more sophisticated technology, all on their own, catching up to their modern human neighbours right at the very end. Museums built entire exhibits around that idea. Textbooks repeated it with confidence. Later evidence complicated that story considerably, with growing research suggesting some of those very same tool traditions may actually trace back to modern humans, instead perhaps even traded borrowed or copied, rather than independently invented. It is a useful reminder that stone does not come with a label attached, and that even trained specialists working with the best intentions can misread the hand that shaped it. I bring that up not to undermine anything we've talked about today, but because I think it says something honest about how real science actually works, especially compared to how it gets portrayed on screen. It rarely moves in one clean, confident line from question to answer. It second-guesses itself constantly. It gets embarrassed. It corrects course sometimes decades later, and keeps going anyway. Slimak knew that risk better than almost anyone, which is exactly why he did not run to a microphone the moment he noticed this pattern. He sat with it. He kept digging. He kept comparing. For roughly 2 decades, this remained little more than an educated hunch whispered mostly in academic papers and conference hallways, the kind of idea that earns a polite nod and a raised eyebrow rather than a headline. I have to imagine that took a particular kind of quiet stubbornness. Most of us, I think, want our best ideas confirmed quickly. We want the applause to arrive somewhere near the moment of the insight itself. Slimak spent the better part of 2 decades holding on to a theory that stone tools alone could never fully prove, waiting for evidence that did not yet exist, built from a technology that had not yet been invented when he first started digging. And then in 2015 that jawbone finally surfaced. And 9 more careful years after that, the genetic laboratory work that followed did something remarkable. It looked at Thorin's ancestry completely independent of any stone tool, completely independent of Slimak's old hunch, and arrived almost eerily at the same conclusion the rocks had been quietly suggesting the entire time. I will admit there is something almost moving about that particular kind of vindication. Not the loud cinematic kind where a scientist throws open a laboratory door and shouts that they were right all along. The quieter kind. The kind where 2 completely different forms of evidence, one carved from stone and one extracted from a molecule far too small to see happen, to arrive at the exact same door decades apart without ever having spoken to one another along the way. There is a small lesson tucked inside that I think, and it has nothing to do with archaeology at all. Most of us at some point carry a quiet suspicion about something we cannot yet prove, a feeling about a person, a decision, a pattern we notice, long before anyone else seems willing to admit it out loud. And most of us, myself included, are tempted to either shout that suspicion too early, before we've earned the right to be believed, or abandon it entirely the moment someone raises an eyebrow. Slimak did neither. He simply kept collecting quiet evidence, one careful season at a time for 20 years, trusting that the truth, if it was really there, would eventually catch up to him. That is a far less glamorous kind of courage than the kind we usually celebrate, but I would argue it is every bit as rare. Slimak himself has since gone somewhere fairly bold with all of this, further than the tools alone could ever take him. He has started describing the eventual disappearance of Neanderthals, not simply as something that happened to them from the outside through climate or competition or misfortune, but as something closer to a pattern woven into how at least some of these communities chose to carry on generation after generation. Populations that quietly kept to themselves, refusing, or perhaps simply never needing to reach outward toward their neighbours, even when those neighbours were settled near enough to matter. I am not going to pretend that is a comfortable idea to sit with, especially this near bedtime. But I do think it is worth turning over in your mind for a moment, because Thorin's story at this point in our journey together has stopped being only a story about bones in the dirt. It has quietly become a story about a choice, or perhaps not even a choice at all, but a deeply rooted habit carried forward through countless small decisions about how tightly to hold on to what you already know, and how far you are willing to reach towards something unfamiliar. I do want to be fair to Slimak here, because this is very clearly his own interpretation, not a settled fact the entire scientific community agrees on without argument. Other researchers studying the same broad period lean harder toward outside explanations, shifting climate-shrinking populations' competition for the same limited game animals during hard winters. Science rarely settles these questions with a single tidy answer, and honestly I think that is exactly how it should work. A good theory should make you argue with it a little. What I find compelling about Slimak's version is simply that it fits so neatly with everything the stone tools had already been quietly hinting at for 2 decades long, before anyone thought to look at a single strand of ancient genetic material. By the time the excavation around Thorin was finally finished, his remains had grown far beyond that first fragment of jaw. Slimak's team eventually recovered 31 individual teeth portions of his skull, small bones from his fingers, and dozens of smaller fragments besides, each one carried out of that cave with the same painstaking care as the very first piece. Taken together, it became the most complete Neanderthal skeleton uncovered in France since 1979, nearly 4 decades earlier. Stop and consider that for a moment. An entire generation of French archaeologists had come and gone, built careers, retired, without ever holding a Neanderthal skeleton this complete in their own hands. And then quietly, in a small cave named after an outlaw, who probably never even set foot inside it, one turned up anyway, one patient fragment at a time over the better part of a decade, which meant that somewhere in a laboratory far from that quiet valley, scientists were now holding something extraordinary. Not just a fragment anymore. Enough of one man to finally ask his bones and the molecules hidden quietly inside them the question Slimak had been carrying for the better part of 2 decades. But holding the right material and actually getting an honest answer out of it turned out to be 2 very different challenges entirely. Ancient genetic material is famously, notoriously difficult to work with. It breaks apart. It absorbs contamination from every hand, every breath, every trace of modern human touch that comes anywhere near it across tens of thousands of years underground. A single mistake in that laboratory, and this entire quiet, patient story could have quietly fallen apart before anyone ever heard Thorin's name. What that laboratory eventually found would turn out to be stranger and far more emotional than even Slimak's own hunch had prepared him for. But to understand exactly how a handful of ancient teeth gets turned into an answer like that, we first need to step inside the very careful, very patient world of the people who devote entire careers to coaxing secrets out of bone that has been resting quietly in the earth for tens of thousands of years. Picture the strangest possible sequel to a muddy archaeological dig. Somewhere far from that valley, in a building that looks nothing like a cave at all, a small group of scientists are standing in a room so clean it barely feels real. No dust, no sunlight, no cicadas humming outside a limestone entrance. Instead, positive pressure air systems hum quietly overhead, constantly pushing filtered air outward so nothing unwanted can drift in. Everyone working inside wears a full protective suit, gloves taped at the wrist, a mask covering everything but their eyes. Surfaces get wiped down with bleach between every single sample, sometimes several times a day, until the whole room smells faintly clinical, almost hospital-like, despite containing nothing more dramatic than a few small containers of ancient tooth powder. And here is the twist that surprises most people the first time they hear it. This entire elaborate setup exists to protect the ancient sample from the scientist, not the other way around. Think about that for a second, because it flips the usual image most of us carry around from films and crime shows. We tend to picture laboratories as places built to contain something dangerous. This kind of laboratory exists to keep something impossibly fragile safe from us, from our skin cells, from our breath, from the enormous invisible cloud of modern genetic material that surrounds every single one of us at all times, simply by virtue of being alive right now, in the present. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about ancient genetic material that almost nobody appreciates until they have tried working with it directly. It does not sit patiently inside a tooth for tens of thousands of years waiting politely to be opened up like a book on a shelf. It breaks. It fragments into pieces sometimes only a few dozen molecular letters long. And worse, it gets buried under an overwhelming flood of other genetic material entirely left behind by centuries of bacteria, fungi, and soil organisms that quietly moved into that same tooth or bone long after its original owner was gone. In a typical sample pulled from ancient bone, only a small percentage of everything extracted actually belongs to the person scientists are hoping to study. The rest is background noise, an accumulated residue of every organism that happened to pass through that same patch of earth over tens of thousands of years. Imagine hosting a small quiet dinner party, only to discover afterward that 99 guests out of every 100 at your table were uninvited strangers who wandered in from the street. Somewhere in that crowded room sits the one guest you actually meant to talk to. Finding them, and only them, is essentially the entire job. For some ancient samples, that ratio's even more discouraging than the dinner party makes it sound. Certain specimens yield genuine, authentic material, representing less than one guest out of every 100 at that same crowded table. Researchers sometimes spend weeks processing a single sample, only to discover once the analysis finally comes back that there simply was not enough of the person left to work with at all. That particular kind of disappointment rarely makes it into any headline, but it happens more often than most people would ever guess quietly in laboratories all over the world every single week. So how do scientists tell the difference? How do they separate one honest ancient voice from a room full of noise that has been accumulating since before written history existed? This is where something almost poetic comes into play. Genetic material does not simply sit still and stay intact once an organism dies. Over thousands of years, it slowly, predictably breaks down in a very particular chemical pattern, a kind of gentle decay that leaves behind a recognizable signature. Researchers can actually examine a strand of extracted material and study the wear on it, the same way you might glance at a pair of old boots, and know instantly they were not purchased last week. Truly ancient material carries this damage consistently, almost like a quiet fingerprint of time itself. Fresh contamination, say from a lab technician's skin brushing against a sample by accident, does not carry that same weathering. It looks new because it is. That single distinction, subtle as it sounds, has saved entire research projects from collapsing into embarrassment, and it very nearly determined whether anyone would ever get to hear Thorin's story at all. The work itself was carried out across two very different institutions, each contributing something the other could not. In Toulouse, researchers connected to the Centre for Anthropobiology and Genomics, worked alongside Slemac, tying the physical remains and their precise position in the cave sediment to everything the genetic material would later reveal. In Copenhagen at the university's Globe Institute, specialists in population genetics took on the far more technical task of actually extracting sequencing and interpreting the fragile material itself. Neither city on its own held the complete picture. It took the distance between them and the willingness to bridge it to finally put the whole story together. Now, when it came to Thorin specifically, the team faced an additional layer of difficulty. Bone tends to fall apart rather quickly compared to teeth, especially bone that spent tens of thousands of years in damp, shifting cave sediment. Teeth, on the other hand, are remarkably stubborn. Enamel is the hardest material the human body produces, harder even than bone itself, and it acts almost like a small natural vault sealing away a tiny reservoir of genetic material deep inside the root long after everything softer around it has quietly given way. There is actually one part of the human skeleton that beats even teeth for this particular purpose tucked away, where almost nobody would think to look. Deep inside the skull, protecting the inner ear, sits an extraordinarily dense, almost stone-like piece of bone. Researchers in this field have learned somewhat by accident over the years that this single small structure can preserve genetic material far better than nearly anywhere else in the entire body, sometimes yielding 100 times more usable material than an ordinary bone fragment. For Thorin, though, it was a molar that ultimately did the job, which makes what researchers managed to pull from it even more impressive, given that teeth, while sturdy, still trail behind that one remarkable structure hidden inside the skull. Working from one single molar, researchers eventually managed to recover something in the neighbourhood of 65% of Thorin's complete genetic blueprint. Sit with that figure for a moment, because it is a remarkably high percentage for a specimen this old. Most ancient samples yield far less, sometimes only scattered fragments, barely useful for anything beyond confirming a species. 65% pulled quietly out of a single tooth that had been resting in the dirt for tens of thousands of years is closer to hitting the lottery than routine laboratory work. Once that raw material was extracted, the next challenge had almost nothing to do with digging and everything to do with an entirely different kind of patience. You cannot simply feed a fragile ancient sample into a machine and watch a tidy readout appear on a screen within the hour the way television always seems to promise. Real genetic sequencing works closer to this. Imagine an enormous, priceless letter that was torn into millions of tiny scraps centuries ago, then scattered, mixed together with scraps from 100 other letters nobody cares about and left outside in the weather. Reconstructing Thorin's story meant sequencing millions of these tiny fragments individually, then using careful computational comparison against previously studied genomes to figure out which scraps belong together and in what order they were originally meant to sit. None of that comparison work happens in a vacuum either. Every previous Neanderthal genome ever sequenced going back years before Thorin was even found effectively becomes a reference shelf that researchers can check new fragments against. Without those earlier studies, patiently built one difficult specimen at a time by teams working across Europe and beyond, there would have been nothing solid to compare Thorin's scattered fragments to at all. In a strange way, every Neanderthal ever previously sequenced quietly helped make Thorin's own story legible, decades before anyone knew his name would eventually need reading. It is slow, it is unglamorous, and it depends enormously on comparing new fragments against a growing library of genetic material gathered from other ancient individuals over the preceding decades, patiently built up study by study, laboratory by laboratory, long before anyone ever imagined a man named Thorin would need it. Which brings me to something I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets. This entire breakthrough did not come from one brilliant individual working alone in a basement, the way these stories so often get portrayed once they reach a screen. It came from an archaeologist based at a research centre in Toulouse, painstakingly excavating a valley for the better part of 2 decades, partnering with a population geneticist based at an institute in Copenhagen, an ocean and a different scientific discipline away. 2 entirely different skill sets, 2 entirely different countries, 2 entirely different ways of asking questions about the same quiet mystery, working together toward one answer that neither of them could have reached alone. Think about how strange that division of labour actually is when you slow down and look at it honestly. One half of this discovery was made with a trowel, a brush, and an aching back in the open air under a Mediterranean sun. The other half was made in near total silence under fluorescent light, by people who may never have set foot inside that cave even once. Both halves were equally necessary. Neither one on its own would have been enough to give Thorin his story back. Population genetics, if you have never come across the term before, is really just the careful study of how groups of living things change and relate to one another across generations traced through the patterns hidden inside their genetic material. It sounds abstract until you realize what it actually lets researchers do. Someone trained in this field can take a scattered handful of ancient fragments and use them to answer questions no amount of careful digging alone could ever settle. Who was this person related to? How long ago did their ancestors part ways from someone else's ancestors? Did their community grow, shrink, or stay roughly the same size across thousands of years? Stone tools can hint at a story. Genetic material examined correctly can actually measure it. I find that far more inspiring, honestly, than the lone genius story we usually get handed in documentaries. Because most of the truly difficult problems worth solving in any field, in any life, tend to require exactly this. Different people holding different pieces of the same puzzle patient enough to hand their piece over to someone else and trust they will know what to do with it, which raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. How many mysteries in your own life or mine might already have an answer sitting somewhere nearby, simply waiting for the right second person to show up and connect it to what you already know? Altogether, from the afternoon that Jawbone first surfaced in the dirt to the morning, this research finally reached the public 9 years past. 9 years spent refining extraction methods that barely existed when the digging first began. 9 years spent waiting more than once for sequencing technology itself to catch up with the questions researchers were already desperate to ask. There were almost certainly failed attempts along the way, samples that yielded too little to work with months of effort that quietly led nowhere and had to be set aside. Nobody writes press releases about the failed attempts, but they are always there, tucked quietly behind every successful headline, forming the actual bulk of what real scientific patience looks like. I will admit there is something almost funny about how differently this work gets portrayed on screen compared to how it actually happens. In any given crime drama, someone swabs a cheek, walks briskly down a hallway, and returns with a full genetic match before the next commercial break hair, still perfectly styled under those harsh studio lights. Real ancient genetic research runs on an entirely different clock, one that owes nothing to television executives worried about pacing. 9 years for one man from one cave sequenced from one very stubborn, very patient tooth. If Thorin's case had been a television episode, the credits would have rolled roughly 8 years and 11 months before anyone actually got an answer. And when the results finally did come back, they turned out to be far stranger and far more moving than a simple confirmation that the bones belonged to a Neanderthal at all. I try sometimes to picture that exact moment. Not the press release, not the published paper sitting neatly formatted in a journal, with a title most of us would never think to search for on our own. the actual moment likely late at night or early on some unremarkable weekday morning when someone sitting at a desk in Copenhagen watched a set of numbers finally resolve into something readable on a screen, and quietly realised that everyone's old assumptions about this particular Neanderthal were about to need rewriting. There is no music in that moment, no dramatic pause. Probably just a tired researcher, a cold cup of coffee, and the strange quiet privilege of being the very first living person to understand something true about a man who died tens of thousands of years earlier. I keep coming back to that image, honestly, because I think it captures something real about how discovery actually feels from the inside as opposed to how we imagine it from the outside. It is rarely loud. It rarely announces itself. Most of the time, it simply arrives quietly in the middle of an otherwise ordinary task to someone who has earned it through years of unremarkable effort that nobody else was watching. But before we get to exactly what the data revealed, there is a smaller, more personal question worth answering first. Because somewhere in the middle of all this painstaking laboratory work, this nameless set of teeth and fragments finally needed something. A spreadsheet full of genetic code could never give him on its own. He needed a name. And the story of how a team of scientists settled on borrowing one from a work of fiction of all places turns out to be its own small, surprisingly touching piece of this puzzle, one that says almost as much about the people doing the naming as it does about the man they were finally getting to know. Naming a fossil is a stranger act than most people ever stop to consider. Think about it for a moment. You're handed a genome, a handful of ancient teeth, a partial skull, and absolutely no way to ask the person a single question about themselves. No name they answered to, no word their mother might have called them across a cold morning in that same valley. Just data and silence and a decision that someone eventually has to make. What do we call this person, now that we finally know enough about them to want to? It turns out this is not a new problem in science at all. It comes up again and again, and the choices researchers make say almost as much about us, the ones doing the naming, as they do about the ancient person receiving it. A frozen traveller pulled from an alpine glacier became known to the world as Otzi, named simply for the valley where hikers happened to find him. A skeleton unearthed in an English cave roughly 10,000 years old took its name from the very same gorge where cheddar cheese was later invented, becoming known ever since as Cheddar Man. Neither name is scientific in any technical sense. Both stuck anyway because a place, a story, or a small human detail tends to travel further in people's memory than a string of letters and numbers ever could. Take one of the most famous fossils ever found, a small, remarkably complete skeleton uncovered in Ethiopia back in 1974. The excavation team spent that entire evening celebrating around a campfire, playing a Beatles song on repeat, the one about a girl in the sky surrounded by diamonds. At some point in that celebration, nobody can quite remember exactly when or by whom someone started calling the skeleton by the name from the song. It stuck immediately, and within a year that fossil, roughly 3 million years old, was known to the entire world simply as Lucy. What strikes me most about that story is how completely unplanned it was. No committee sat down beforehand to debate the perfect, dignified name for the oldest, most complete early human ancestor ever recovered at that point. It happened almost by accident in a moment of pure celebration, and the informality of it never seemed to diminish how seriously the world went on to take the discovery itself. Here is the detail I find quietly moving about that particular story, the one that rarely makes it into the shorter versions. Lucy already had another name given by the country where she was found. In Ethiopia she is known as Dinkinesh, which translates roughly to "You are marvellous." 2 names for one ancient woman born from 2 entirely different cultures existing side by side for exactly the same set of bones. I bring that up, not to argue one name deserves more respect than the other, but because it says something honest about how differently people across the world reach for meaning when they encounter something this old. Some reach for a beloved song, others reach for a simple, sincere compliment offered across 3 million years to someone who will never hear it. So when it came time to name the Neanderthal from the Rhone Valley Slimak, and his colleagues were stepping into a tradition with real weight behind it, not inventing something frivolous on the spot, they landed on Thorin. Now, if you have never come across the source material, let me set the stage properly, because the choice makes far more sense once you understand exactly who this name originally belonged to. Thorin comes from a novel published in the 1930s by the British author John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, a story better known today simply as The Hobbit. In that book, Thorin leads a small company of dwarves on a dangerous journey back toward a mountain that once belonged to his family, a home they were violently driven out of by a dragon generations before the story even begins. He's not, by the way, an easy character to love. Tolkien wrote him as proud, stubborn, quick to take offence, weighed down by an almost inherited obsession with reclaiming gold and status that had already ruined members of his own family line before him. His own grandfather, ruling the same mountain kingdom generations earlier, fell into a similar hunger for treasure, so consuming that other characters in the wider mythology describe it almost as a sickness passed down through the family, waiting patiently to resurface in each new generation. Thorin, for most of the story, appears to be walking directly toward that same inherited trap with his eyes wide open. He argued with his companions. He refuses fair offers out of sheer wounded pride, even when accepting them would clearly serve everyone better, his own people included. For most of the book, he is far closer to a cautionary tale about greed than a traditional hero, and yet right at the very end, dying from wounds taken in one final desperate battle, something in him quietly breaks open. He reconciles with the one companion he had wronged, most admits in his own stubborn way that he had spent far too long chasing treasure instead of the people and simple comforts that actually mattered. It is a small human moment of clarity arriving far later than it should have, at the very last possible second it still could. I've always found that particular ending oddly moving, even as a child reading it for the first time long before I had any reason to think it might one day connect to a real archaeological discovery. There is something universally recognizable about a proud person finally softening, but only once softening no longer costs them anything. It is not a flattering trait. It is, if anything, a deeply human one, which is perhaps the entire point Tolkien was making about a character who was never actually human at all. Here is what struck me sitting with this comparison far longer than I probably needed to. Thorin in that story is explicitly described as one of the last kings of his particular royal line, the final significant figure standing at the end of a long, proud, increasingly isolated lineage. Slimak has said in his own words that he saw an eerie echo of exactly that idea sitting inside the real bones from Grotta Mandrin. Not simply a person who happened to die near the end of his species, but someone who appeared to represent the closing chapter of an entire distinct branch of Neanderthal life. A lineage running out quietly with no one left afterward to carry it forward. I want to sit with that parallel a little longer because I think it goes even deeper than the obvious headline comparison. Remember what we talked about regarding those stone tools, the stubborn, unchanging tradition passed down for roughly 10,000 years without picking up a single outside influence. Tolkien's dwarves, if you explore enough of his wider writing, are consistently portrayed the same way. Insular, deeply attached to inherited custom. Slow to trust outsiders and fiercely resistant to changing how they have always done things, even when changing might clearly serve them better. A scholar studying Tolkien's work once described this trait in his dwarves as something akin to a besetting sin of possessiveness, an inability to let go of what already belongs to you, even at real cost to yourself. I'm not going to pretend that a novel written in the 1930s somehow predicted a specific archaeological finding from the Rhone Valley. That would be reaching, and I try not to reach on this channel. But I do think it is worth noticing when a piece of fiction happens to rhyme so precisely with something true, purely by accident, because the parallel does illuminate something. Stubborn attachment to the familiar carried far enough for long enough eventually starts to look a great deal like isolation from the outside. Whether that describes dwarves guarding a mountain of gold or a small community of Neanderthals, holding on to one particular way of shaping stone for 10,000 consecutive years, the underlying shape of the story feels remarkably similar. There is a difference worth naming honestly, though, before this comparison gets away from me. Tolkien's dwarves chose their isolation, at least within the logic of the story, clinging to old grudges and old treasure out of pride. We have no way of knowing whether Thorin's actual community chose anything at all. Perhaps isolation crept in slowly through geography or language, or 100 small social habits none of us could ever reconstruct from a handful of ancient teeth. Fiction gets the luxury of assigning motive. Archaeology almost never does. That gap between the two, I think, is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidier story. Let me pause here and ask you something, because I am curious. When you first heard this man had been nicknamed after a dwarf from a fantasy story, did it strike you as a strange, almost disrespectful choice? Or does it make a little more sense now, hearing the reasoning behind it? I would honestly love to know which camp you landed in, because I suspect this channel probably attracts both kinds of viewers, in fairly equal measure the ones who want their history treated with strict formality, and the ones who appreciate a little poetry mixed in with the facts. I will admit my own answer changed the more I learned about it. My first instinct hearing about it second-hand was mild skepticism, the same reflex I imagine plenty of you had. It can feel on the surface like scientists reaching for something cute and marketable, rather than something meaningful, the kind of decision made by a committee, thinking about headlines rather than history. But once you actually sit with why this particular name was chosen, rather than simply that a name was chosen, it starts to feel less like branding and more like an act of genuine interpretation. One scientist reading a quiet symbolic truth inside a set of bones and reaching for the only language precise enough to describe it. I also think, if I'm honest, that there is something a little humbling about the alternative. Left unnamed, this man would have remained a specimen number in a database somewhere referenced only by catalogue codes and layer designations that mean nothing to anyone outside the field. A name, even a borrowed one, even a name lifted from a children's fantasy novel about dragons and treasure, does something a specimen number simply cannot. It invites the rest of us in. It turns a data point back into a person, if only briefly, if only imperfectly. Consider for a moment how differently this entire video might have felt to you if I had spent the last several minutes referring to him only by a laboratory reference code instead. The facts would be identical. The genetic material would tell the exact same story. But something in you, I suspect, would have struggled to stay with it the way you have stayed with Thorin. We are simply built that way, all of us. Numbers inform us, names invite us to care, and it is worth remembering this could easily have gone a very different direction. Fossils have ended up with far less poetic names throughout the history of this field, sometimes nothing more than a site abbreviation, followed by a catalogue number, technically accurate and entirely forgettable. If you had opened this decision up to a public vote online, I suspect we would all be enduring a considerably sillier name by now, and possibly reading it out loud to you at this very moment with a completely straight face. I am, for what it is worth, quietly grateful it never came to that. There is one more layer to this naming choice that I think deserves a moment before we move forward, because it says something about timing and about how strange scientific discovery can be. When Slimak first proposed his theory about a distinct isolated population in this valley, decades before any genetic material confirmed it, he had absolutely no way of knowing whether he would ever be proven right. He could easily have spent an entire career being quietly wrong, his hunch fading into an unremarkable footnote nobody bothered to revisit. Instead, the name given so early, chosen almost on instinct based on nothing more than the emotional shape of an old story about a lineage nearing its end, turned out to describe the science with startling precision once the real data finally arrived. That is either a wonderful coincidence or something akin to earned intuition built from 20 years of paying more attention than almost anyone else was willing to. I lean toward the second explanation for what it is worth, though I will admit that is a matter of taste rather than proof. Scientists are not supposed to name things based on gut feeling. They are trained quite rightly to follow evidence rather than instinct. And yet here instinct and evidence ended up walking arm in arm toward the exact same conclusion years apart, without either one waiting politely for the other to catch up. Either way, the name held. And now for the first time in this story, we finally get to look directly at what that genetic material actually revealed once scientists in Copenhagen sat down and studied it properly. Because everything we have covered so far, the jawbone, the cave, the stubborn old tools, the borrowed name from a mountain kingdom that no longer exists, all of it was quietly building toward one single, almost unbelievable number. A number so strange that it is easy to imagine a researcher staring at the screen quietly wondering just for a moment whether something in the laboratory had gone wrong. It had not gone wrong. It was simply the truth arriving in a form nobody had fully prepared themselves to receive. Somewhere in Copenhagen on an otherwise unremarkable day, a set of numbers finally settled into place on a researcher's screen, and the story of Thorin quietly stopped being about stone tools and careful hunches altogether. From that point forward, it became something else entirely. A genetic mystery sitting right in the middle of a species we thought we understood fairly well by now. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a result like this first appears one very different from excitement. More like disbelief quietly checking itself before allowing any celebration. Researchers in this field learn early to distrust a result that looks too clean, too strange, too perfectly suited to make a compelling headline. So before anyone reached for a phone to share the news, the numbers would have been checked, rechecked, and checked again. Run through every possible alternative explanation the team could think of just to make sure nothing as simple as contamination or a processing error was quietly responsible for a number this unusual. Let me walk you through what that screen actually showed, because the number itself needs a little unpacking before it can land the way it deserves to. Every Neanderthal who has ever had genetic material successfully extracted belongs in some sense to a family tree. Branches split apart over tens of thousands of years, populations drift away from one another, and researchers can measure roughly when any two branches last shared a common ancestor. The same way you might trace when two distant cousins' family lines last crossed paths. Think of it almost like two rivers that once flowed from the exact same spring, slowly drifting apart across a landscape until centuries later, they empty into entirely different seas, never having touched again along the way. When scientists compared Thorin's genetic material against every other late Neanderthal genome available to them, the branch he belonged to split away from the rest of the family tree somewhere around 105,000 years ago. Sit with that figure for just a moment, because on its own it is not actually the strange part yet. Populations split apart across deep time constantly. That alone would be an interesting but fairly ordinary finding. Branches diverge. That is simply how family trees work for Neanderthals just as much as for us. Here is where it turns strange. Thorin himself, based on the sediment layer where his remains were found, and several independent dating methods applied to teeth and bones buried near him, most likely walked through that valley somewhere between 50,000 and 42,000 years ago. Now do the arithmetic with me for a second. If his lineage split away from other Neanderthals around 105,000 years ago, and he himself was alive as recently as 50 to 42,000 years ago, that leaves a gap of roughly 50,000 years sitting quietly in between. 50,000 years during which his community's genetic material shows no meaningful sign of mixing back in with anyone else's. Not reduced contact, not occasional contact. As near to zero as genetic science is currently able to measure. To put that scale into some kind of perspective, a person can actually hold on to 50,000 years ago. Our own species had not yet reached most of Europe in any significant numbers. Entire climate cycles rose and fell within that window. Ice sheets advanced, retreated, and advanced again. And for the entire length of that staggering stretch of time, one small community of Neanderthals living in a valley, other Neanderthals also knew and used, appears to have quietly kept to itself generation after generation, without leaving behind a single convincing genetic trace of reconnecting with its wider family. This is, if you will forgive the phrase, a genome that should not exist. Not because it is fake or flawed or somehow impossible. It exists undeniably sequenced and published, and sitting in a respected scientific journal for anyone to examine. It should not exist in the sense that almost nothing about typical Neanderthal population patterns prepared researchers to find something like it. Before Thorin, the working assumption among most specialists was that late Neanderthals across Western Europe functioned as something akin to one large loosely connected population, regularly exchanging mates across considerable distances, the way scattered human communities tend to even when spread thin across a landscape. Thorin's genetic material quietly broke that assumption into pieces. Now there is a second layer to this discovery, one that on its own might have been the headline of an entirely different, less dramatic story. Buried inside Thorin's genetic material, researchers found unusually long repeated stretches where both copies of his genetic code, the one inherited from each parent, matched each other almost perfectly. Roughly 7% of his entire genome appeared this way, including a noticeable portion in exceptionally long unbroken stretches. In plain terms, this is the kind of genetic signature you typically see when blood relatives have children together, repeated across multiple generations within a small, tightly bonded community. To translate that 7% into something a little easier to picture, imagine unrolling the entire length of Thorin's genetic code like a very long ribbon. Somewhere around 1/20th of that ribbon would show up as two identical halves mirrored perfectly letter for letter, a pattern that essentially never happens by chance in a large, freely mixing population. It takes generations of a small number of people repeatedly choosing partners from within the same limited circle to produce a signature this pronounced. I want to be careful with how I frame this part because it is easy for a detail like this to get sensationalized in a way that feels almost cruel toward people who had no choice in the size of the world they were born into. This pattern is not unique to Neanderthals, and it is not some kind of moral failing. Human societies throughout history, including plenty still practicing these customs comfortably today, have organized marriage and family structures around tightly knit kinship for entirely practical reasons, often tied to land resources trust, or simply the limited number of available neighbours within walking distance. Thorin's community, by every indication available to us, was small enough that generation after generation choices about partnership were probably limited by simple arithmetic rather than any preference at all. Interestingly, Thorin was not even the most extreme case researchers have ever documented. An earlier, considerably older Neanderthal individual recovered from a cave system in Siberia showed even higher levels of this same genetic signature, closer to 1/10 of her entire genome in similarly long-repeated stretches. Her community, by every measure available, was even smaller and even more isolated than Thorin's ever appears to have been. Which tells us something important, I think. This was not some strange isolated anomaly, limited to one unlucky population in one valley in France. It appears to have been a fairly persistent feature of Neanderthal life, more broadly across an enormous span of geography and time long before Thorin's own community ever existed, and continuing long after in places thousands of miles to the east. Taken together, these findings are quietly rewriting something fundamental about how researchers picture Neanderthal society as a whole. For years, the working image was fairly uniform. One species spread thin but reasonably interconnected across an entire continent, mixing and mingling much the way scattered human hunter-gatherer groups tend to. What keeps emerging instead, sample after sample, cave after cave, is something closer to a mosaic. Small self-contained communities, each with their own genetic fingerprint, their own tightly bonded family structures, occasionally connecting with neighbours, and just as often apparently not. So here is a question worth turning over for a moment. If small, tightly related communities were common enough across the Neanderthal world to show up again and again in genetic material recovered from opposite ends of a continent, what does that tell us about the actual texture of their day-to-day existence? Not the version of Neanderthals often imagined roaming vast connected territories in loose confederation with distant cousins. Something smaller, quieter, a patchwork of insular self-contained little worlds, most of them probably numbering in the dozens rather than the hundreds, each one largely responsible for its own survival. There is a real biological cost buried inside that kind of arrangement, and it is worth explaining plainly because it connects directly to the larger extinction. Question this entire story eventually circles back toward. In a small population, harmful genetic mutations have a much harder time getting filtered out over generations. In a larger well-mixed population, natural selection has plenty of raw material to work with, weeding out damaging variants relatively efficiently across enough individuals. In a small, isolated group, the mathematics work against you. Harmful mutations can spread simply through chance generation after generation, accumulating slowly into what researchers call genetic load, a quiet compounding burden on a population's long-term ability to survive and reproduce successfully. Think of it a little like a small sealed savings account that only ever collects interest and never gets a fresh deposit from outside. In a large open population, harmful variants that appear in one generation are usually diluted, balanced out, or eventually bred out entirely by the sheer number of different genetic combinations available. In a small, isolated one, those same harmful variants simply keep compounding quietly, generation after generation, with no new genetic material ever arriving to offset them. Nobody inside that community would have understood any of this happening, of course. There was no test to run, no warning sign to notice. The cost would only have become visible across many lifetimes, far too gradual for any single person to ever recognize in their own immediate experience. None of that alone explains why Neanderthals eventually disappeared. I want to be honest about that because a tidy single explanation would feel satisfying right now, and I do not think the evidence actually supports handing you one. But it does add a meaningful piece to a much larger, more complicated puzzle, one where isolation, small community size, and accumulated genetic burden may have quietly stacked the odds against certain populations long before any dramatic, decisive moment of crisis ever arrived. Here is the detail that stays with me longest out of everything in this particular study, and it involves a comparison researchers made to an entirely different group of people living during roughly the same broad window of prehistory. Early modern humans documented in Siberia around the same rough era show clear genetic evidence of something Neanderthal populations largely do not. Deliberately structured mating networks, small communities intentionally maintaining ties with other small communities specifically to avoid exactly the kind of concentrated inbreeding we just discussed. In other words, at least some early groups of our own species appear to have actively solved this exact problem culturally, generations before anyone understood a single thing about genetics in any formal sense. Picture what that would have actually required logistically for a group of early modern humans scattered across an unforgiving Siberian landscape. Regular, deliberate travel between distant camps. Some agreed upon understanding passed down through storytelling or ritual or simple habit, about which neighbouring group your children were expected to eventually marry into. A kind of social infrastructure invisible and unwritten, but functioning almost like a biological safety net stretched across an entire region. None of that happens by accident. It requires trust between strangers, a willingness to travel toward the unfamiliar, and enough shared language or custom to make that kind of exchange possible in the first place. I find that comparison quietly remarkable and a little humbling, honestly. Somewhere in our deep past, without any scientific understanding of what they were doing or why it mattered, small groups of early humans built social customs, likely rules about marriage, kinship, and which neighbouring group you were expected to visit and exchange partners with, that solved a biological problem their bodies alone never could have solved. Culture in that sense was quietly doing the work of medicine tens of thousands of years before medicine, as we understand it, existed at all. Before we move any further into what all of this actually meant for how these two kinds of people spent their days, let me offer one small, almost light-hearted detail buried inside the same research, because this entire conversation has understandably grown a little heavy. Examining Thorin's jaw in careful detail, researchers noticed something unusual tucked toward the back of his mouth, an extra pair of molars that most people then or now simply do not grow. It is a rare, largely harmless anatomical quirk, the kind of small genetic footnote that shows up more often in smaller, more tightly related populations than in larger, more genetically varied ones. I mention it partly because it is a strange, oddly charming little detail to end a heavy section on, and partly because it quietly reinforces everything the rest of his genetic material was already trying to tell us, written this time in bone rather than in code. So let me ask you this, because I am curious where you land on it. Knowing that Thorin's community stayed almost entirely to themselves for 50,000 years, even while other people, both Neanderthal and eventually modern human, moved through country near enough to reach on foot within a matter of days, does that sound to you like isolation forced upon them by circumstance, or something nearer to a choice, quietly repeated across thousands of generations? Because that particular question, how near is truly near, and what exactly kept two groups of people apart despite barely any real distance between them, that all turns out to be far stranger and far more revealing than anything we have covered so far. And it is exactly where this story needs to go next. Let's actually do the walking for a moment instead of just talking about distance in the abstract. 10 days. That is the figure Slimak eventually settled on when he tried to describe how far Thorin's community sat from the nearest other Neanderthal population whose genetic material has ever been recovered. Not 10 years, not 10 generations, 10 days on foot across open country, the kind of journey a determined group of hunters could realistically complete inside a single autumn with time to spare on either end. Picture it in terms you can actually hold in your hands. 10 days of steady walking at a pace a fit adult could sustain without particularly heroic effort covers something in the neighborhood of 200 kilometers give or take, depending on terrain weather and how many rivers happen to sit in the way. That is roughly the distance between two mid-sized cities in many parts of the world today, a stretch you or I could cover by car in a single unhurried afternoon. Not an ocean, not a mountain range with no way through it. A walk, long certainly, demanding absolutely, but entirely within reach for a species already well practiced at crossing exactly this kind of open landscape in search of game. Think about the last time you drove somewhere roughly that distance, maybe to visit family or attend some gathering you almost talked yourself out of going to. Now imagine that same stretch of road except walking. It was well within the physical capability of everyone involved, and at the far end waited an entire community of your own kind, speaking some version of a language you might have partly understood, hunting the same animals, sheltering from the same winters. And across 50,000 years, as far as anyone can currently tell, that particular door never once opened from either side. And yet, according to every scrap of genetic material recovered so far, nobody made that walk. Not once in either direction across 50,000 years. Slimak has been fairly direct about how strange he finds this, and I think his framing is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. He has described this particular arrangement as something that would be almost impossible to imagine among our own species. Two neighbouring communities near enough to reach one another within days coexisting for tens of thousands of years, while behaving genetically speaking as though the other simply did not exist. His conclusion, and I find this quietly haunting every time I turn it over in my mind, is that Neanderthals may have understood the shape of their own world in a way fundamentally different from how we understand ours. Let me push on that idea for a moment because I think it deserves more than a passing mention before we move forward. Think about your own species honestly for a second. Human beings are by almost every measure anthropologists have ever devised relentless networkers. We trade. We intermarry across vast distances. We send our curiosity walking toward the horizon almost compulsively even when nothing forces us to. And this is not a recent habit born from modern convenience or idle boredom. It runs remarkably deep. Consider a detail that has always stuck with me from an entirely different corner of the world, roughly the same broad era we've been discussing tonight. At an early human site in the Middle East, positioned some 50 kilometers from the nearest coastline, archaeologists have recovered small shells, deliberately pierced, clearly meant to be strung together and worn. Those shells did not walk there on their own. Somebody carried them, or traded for them, moving them steadily inland across a meaningful stretch of territory, purely as far as anyone can tell for the sake of decoration. Further north in parts of Europe occupied by early modern humans, roughly 30,000 years ago, archaeologists have found seashells from coastlines hundreds of kilometers away, sitting quietly in settlements built deep in the continental interior. Somebody wanted those shells badly enough to move them hand to hand, likely across several different communities, none of whom needed to personally walk the entire distance themselves. Stop and consider what that actually implies about the people involved. Nobody needed to trust the coast dweller personally. They only needed to trust their nearest neighbour, who trusted their own nearest neighbour in turn, in a chain stretching further than any single pair of feet would ever travel. That is an extraordinary kind of social technology, invisible, unwritten, requiring no formal agreement or shared language beyond whatever gestures and goodwill got the job done. It asks something of a community that goes well beyond simple survival. It asks for patience, memory, and a working assumption that the stranger 3 valleys over is worth the trouble of staying friendly with on the small chance you will one day need something only they can offer. That is what a network looks like, written directly into the archaeological record. Not proof of any single epic journey, but proof of countless small, repeated, unglamorous connections, one neighbouring group handing something along to the next over and over, until an object could travel further than any individual person carrying it ever actually walked. Neanderthal sites across an enormous span of time and geography show remarkably little of this. Tools built almost entirely from locally available stone. Ornamentation where it exists at all made from whatever happened to be near at hand. Vanishingly little evidence of goods, ideas, or people consistently moving in from somewhere else. Researchers have looked hard for exceptions and found a small handful here and there scattered fragments of raw material carried somewhat further than expected. But set against the sheer volume and consistency of exchange visible in early Homo sapiens sites, those exceptions look more like rare accidents than an established habit. It is not that Neanderthals lacked intelligence or creativity, or the physical capability to walk exactly as far as any Homo sapiens community could. The archaeological record increasingly makes clear they were resourceful, adaptable, and every bit as capable of solving hard problems as their contemporaries. What appears to be different over and over, site after site, is this specific, almost invisible impulse. The pull toward the stranger over the hill, the willingness to hand something valuable to someone you barely know, trusting the exchange will eventually come back around. There is a concept from modern anthropology I think is worth mentioning here carefully, because I do not want to overstate what it can actually tell us about people who existed this long ago. Researchers studying human social behaviour have proposed that our brains are built to comfortably manage a fairly specific number of stable relationships at once, something in the rough neighbourhood of 150 meaningful connections based partly on the size and structure of our brains compared to other primates. The idea grew out of studying how group size scales across different species of monkeys and apes, comparing the portion of the brain most associated with social reasoning against the average number of individuals each species tends to track and manage within its own troop. Applied to humans, it roughly predicts the size of a typical village, a manageable friend group, even the guest list at a wedding most people can comfortably imagine attending. Whether anything resembling that same mathematical ceiling applied to Neanderthal cognition remains entirely unknown. Their brains, by most measurements, were comparable in size to ours, occasionally even larger. But size alone does not tell us how that capacity was organized, or what kind of social architecture it was actually built to support. It is entirely possible their minds were just as capable of holding wide, sprawling social networks as ours are, and simply chose generation after generation not to build them. It is equally possible something about how their particular kind of mind processed unfamiliar people made that stranger over the hill feel like a genuine threat rather than an opportunity. I do not think we can currently say for certain which explanation sits closer to the truth, and I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. What I can tell you is that the pattern shows up again and again in valley after valley, and it is beginning to look less like a strange local exception, and more like something closer to a defining feature of an entire way of being human, one quietly different from our own. Here is a small technical detail that I think illustrates just how precisely researchers can measure nearness in time, even when they cannot yet explain the distance in trust. Scientists studying this same cave have examined thin layers of soot left behind on the limestone walls by countless small cooking fires lit across tens of thousands of years. Every fire leaves the faintest smudge behind, and over enough centuries those smudges stack into something almost like tree rings, thin dark bands pressed into the stone itself, each one a record of somebody once warming their hands in that exact spot. By carefully reading the sequence of those layers, researchers have been able to place the final Neanderthal occupation and the earliest arrival of modern humans within roughly 6 months of one another, at the very outside edge of what the evidence can support. 6 months, not 60,000 years, not 6,000. 6 months separating one kind of people from another in the exact same small shelter of stone. I find something almost vertigo-inducing about that number, if I am honest. 6 months is nothing. 6 months is a single winter, a single hunting season, the length of time it might take news to travel under the right circumstances from one end of a modest territory to the other. And yet, as far as the genetic record can tell us, that near miss in time changed absolutely nothing about the underlying pattern. The two groups came astonishingly near to overlapping, perhaps even did overlap for a matter of weeks, and then simply continued on each, within their own separate story, as though the other had never been there at all. Sit with the strangeness of holding both of those facts in your mind at once. In terms of raw calendar time, these groups occasionally missed each other by less than a single season. And yet, in terms of anything resembling a shared genetic or cultural thread, entire tens of thousands of years could pass with functionally nothing crossing between them at all. Proximity, it turns out, was never really the barrier here. Something else was standing in the way, something far harder to date with a soot sample or a strand of ancient genetic material. I keep circling back to a particular question when I think about this, and I want to offer it to you honestly, rather than pretend I have a tidy answer waiting at the end of it. What would it actually feel like, generation after generation, to grow up fully aware that other people existed somewhere not far beyond your own valley, and to simply never go looking for them, not out of fear necessarily, perhaps not even out of choice in any way we would recognize as a choice? Maybe it never occurred to anyone that there was anything worth walking toward. Maybe the entire concept of a stranger worth trusting had simply never taken root in whatever version of a mind Thorin's ancestors carried through that valley. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that image that has stayed with me far longer than I expected it to when I first started researching this story. Not the loneliness of a single person isolated by unusual circumstance. Something larger and quieter than that. An entire lineage spanning thousands of generations carrying out complete lifetimes, full of whatever joy, grief, hunger, and small daily satisfaction a human existence actually contains, without ever once reaching in any way we can measure beyond the edges of a world that could apparently be crossed in little more than a week. I do not say that to romanticize sadness onto people who almost certainly experience their own existence as entirely ordinary, filled with whatever counted as normal and familiar within the only world they'd ever known. Comparison is our habit, not necessarily theirs. But I would be lying if I told you that particular thought does not sit with me a little differently now than it did before I started digging into this story. So let me ask you honestly, because I think this is worth turning over before we move any further. If you discovered one quiet afternoon that an entire community had been settled, just a short journey from your own home for your whole life, and neither side had ever once reached out, what do you think would explain that silence more convincingly? Fear of the unfamiliar, simple lack of curiosity, or something closer to a truly different way of understanding where one life ends and another begins? Because as strange as that 10-day gap already sounds, it turns out to be only part of a much larger picture. Thorin's closest known genetic relative was not hiding in some nearby valley at all. His nearest match turns up in an entirely different corner of the map altogether, and the story of how his ancestors likely got there is stranger and considerably more moving than anything we have covered so far tonight. Here is where the map stops making sense in the way you might expect it to. If Thorin's closest known relative had turned up in the next valley over, or even several days' walk beyond it, this would already be a strange enough story to sit with. Instead, when researchers searched through every previously sequenced Neanderthal genome available to them, hunting for the closest genetic match to the man from Grotta Mandrin, the answer came back from a place that should, by every reasonable expectation, have been a stranger to him. A skull recovered from Gibraltar at the very southern tip of Spain, more than 1,000 kilometers from the Rhone Valley, sitting almost near enough to touch the coast of Africa across a narrow strip of water. Pull up a map in your mind for a second if you can. Start at the Rhone Valley in the south of France and trace a line downward past Marseille, past the Spanish border, along the entire curve of the Mediterranean coastline, past Barcelona, past Valencia, all the way down to the very last outcrop of rock before Europe simply runs out and the sea takes over. That is roughly the distance separating these two men. Not a shared valley, not a shared mountain range, an entire coastline curling along the bottom edge of an entire continent. Let that distance settle for a moment against everything we just spent time discussing. 10 days' walk and total genetic silence between neighbours. And now, on the other end of the scale over 1,000 kilometres, an entire continent's width apart, and yet Thorin's own genetic material points there before it points anywhere closer to home. Proximity, it turns out, tells you almost nothing about kinship in this story. Distance tells you almost nothing about connection. Whatever actually determined who belonged to whom, it clearly was not simple geography. Before I explain what researchers think this connection actually means, I want to take you to Gibraltar itself for a moment because its own history with Neanderthals is stranger and considerably older than most people realise, and it deserves its own telling. In 1848, 7 years before anyone had ever heard the word Neanderthal, a Royal Artillery officer named Edmund Flint was overseeing quarry work on the northern face of the Rock of Gibraltar, when workers uncovered a skull, clearly old, clearly unusual, embedded in the limestone. Flint presented it to the local scientific society, where it was carefully catalogued, discussed politely, and then largely forgotten. There was at the time no such category as Neanderthal for anyone to place it into. The word itself did not exist yet. 8 years later, in a limestone valley in Germany called the Neander Valley Quarry, workers found different bones from a different individual entirely, and this time the scientific world took proper notice. Within a decade, researchers had a name for this strange new kind of ancient human, and that name, drawn from the German valley where the second discovery happened to occur, is the one that stuck permanently in every language, every textbook, every documentary made about this species ever since. I find something almost comic in a quiet historical sort of way about how near we came to calling an entire branch of humanity something else entirely. Had anyone in 1848 fully understood what Flint's quarry workers had actually found, we might spend our evenings tonight talking about Gibraltar man instead of Neanderthals. Sometimes the difference between obscurity and immortality in this field comes down to nothing more dramatic than which discovery happened to land in front of the right specialist first. Gibraltar was not finished revealing itself after that. In 1926, an archaeologist named Dorothy Garrod, who would later become the first woman ever appointed to a full professorship at both Cambridge and Oxford, excavated a rock shelter nearby known as Devil's Tower and uncovered the skull of a Neanderthal child. Garrod was by every account a formidable presence in a field that offered women remarkably little room at the time, and her willingness to keep excavating this same stretch of coastline eventually helped establish Gibraltar as one of the most significant Neanderthal sites anywhere on the planet, decades before most of her male contemporaries took the region seriously. And decades after that, ongoing excavation at a site called Gorham's Cave revealed something even more remarkable, an unbroken record of Neanderthal life stretching across more than 100,000 years, layer after layer, one of the longest continuous occupation sequences ever documented anywhere for this entire species. Here is what makes Gibraltar so scientifically important beyond simply being an early discovery site. Southern Iberia, largely thanks to its position and its mild coastal climate, appears to have remained relatively stable and hospitable across enormous stretches of time when much of northern Europe was locked under advancing and retreating ice. Researchers increasingly refer to this stretch of Mediterranean coastline as a refuge, a place where Neanderthal populations could continue their way of life comfortably long after conditions elsewhere had turned hostile. Some studies have even suggested Neanderthals may have persisted in this exact region later than almost anywhere else on the planet, though the precise final chapter of that timeline remains actively debated among specialists. Now here is where the story starts to rhyme with everything we have already uncovered about Thorin in a way I did not expect when I first started researching this particular thread. The tools recovered from Gorham's cave across the entire 100,000-year sequence show something researchers describe as remarkable stability. The newest stone tools pulled from the uppermost layers look almost identical to the oldest ones recovered from the very bottom, all belonging to the same broad tradition that had already existed for hundreds of thousands of years before Gibraltar's Neanderthals ever arrived. Perhaps most strikingly of all, researchers identified a single hearth inside Gorham's cave that appears to have been used repeatedly by generation after generation for more than 8,000 years. Try to hold that number honestly in your mind for a moment, because it is easy to let a figure like that slide past without really landing. 8,000 years is longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization, longer than writing cities or agriculture as most of us understand them. And for the whole of that immense stretch, something as small and ordinary as where a fire got lit inside one particular cave apparently never needed to change. Different faces, different generations, the same familiar circle of blackened stone warming hands that had never met one another and never would. Sit with that figure next to the one we discussed earlier regarding the Rhone Valley. 10,000 years of unchanged tool-making tradition in one isolated Mediterranean valley. 8,000 years around a single hearth in another isolated Mediterranean refuge hundreds of kilometers away. Two separate communities separated by an enormous stretch of coastline, both apparently settling into the same pattern of deep, almost unshakable continuity generation, folding quietly into generation without much appetite for reinvention. That is not proof of a direct connection on its own. Plenty of unrelated human communities across history have independently arrived at long stretches of cultural stability without ever meeting one another. But it does suggest something worth taking seriously. Whatever conditions encourage this kind of deep-rooted permanence, whether cultural, psychological, or simply a product of comfortable resource, rich environments that never forced anyone to adapt that pattern, was not unique to the valley Thorin called home. It shows up again independently in one of the most thoroughly studied Neanderthal sites anywhere on the planet, and then genetics arrived to make the coincidence considerably harder to dismiss. A research team examining ancient genetic material recovered from the original Gibraltar skull, the very same one Flint had handed over all those years earlier, faced a genuine technical struggle before they could even begin. Warm coastal climates are notoriously unkind to ancient genetic material, and this particular specimen had also absorbed considerable modern contamination, simply from decades of handling by curious hands long before anyone had proper laboratory protocols in place. Researchers eventually had to develop entirely new extraction methods just to separate the faint, genuine ancient signal from the overwhelming layer of modern noise sitting on top of it. What they found once that separation finally succeeded made headlines years before anyone had ever heard of Thorin. That individual's genetic material turned out to be noticeably more similar to considerably older Neanderthals, some from as far away as Belgium and Germany dated to roughly 120,000 years ago, than to other Neanderthals living far closer by geographically speaking at a much later date. In other words, Gibraltar had already produced its own small, quiet example of a genome that seemed to belong to an earlier chapter of the story than the individual's actual lifetime should have allowed. When Slimak's team eventually compared Thorin against this same Gibraltar material, the resemblance was near enough to suggest something larger than coincidence. His working theory, offered carefully and without excessive certainty, is that both individuals may descend from a once broader Mediterranean population, an old lineage that likely stretched at some earlier point along the warm southern coastline, all the way from the westernmost tip of the Iberian Peninsula to the Rhône Valley in France. Not one tightly connected society sharing news and neighbours along that entire stretch necessarily, but a shared ancestral route splintering slowly over tens of thousands of years into smaller, increasingly isolated pockets, each one eventually losing meaningful contact with the others. I want to be honest with you about the limits of that theory because I think it is important, and because I would rather earn your trust slowly than hand you a tidier story than the evidence actually supports. Genetic material recovered from this broader Mediterranean region remains frustratingly sparse. Warm coastal climates ironically tend to be far harder on ancient genetic preservation than the cold, dry conditions found further north and east, which means entire chapters of this particular population story may simply never be recoverable, no matter how good future laboratory techniques eventually become. What we have is a compelling thread, not a complete tapestry, a shared echo across enormous distance rather than a fully mapped family tree. Let me offer you one more detail from Gibraltar before we move forward, because I think it belongs here, and because this conversation has understandably carried some weight tonight. In 2012, researchers examining a quiet ledge deep inside Gorham's Cave, a spot that appears to have once served as a sleeping area, found something carved directly into the bedrock. A series of deliberate intersecting lines, cut with obvious intention, buried beneath sediment layers, roughly 39,000 years old. Nobody can tell you exactly what it meant to the person who made it. There is no accompanying story, no context, no way to ask. But it stands as far as current evidence shows as the oldest known example of abstract mark-making attributed to a Neanderthal hand, quiet proof that whatever else defined these isolated Mediterranean communities, an impulse toward meaning, toward leaving something intentional behind on a wall, meant for no practical purpose at all, was very much present among them too. I find that detail strangely comforting, if I am honest, sitting at the end of a section otherwise built almost entirely around distance and disconnection. Whatever kept these communities from reaching toward each other, it clearly was not an absence of inner life. Somebody in a quiet cave overlooking the sea once picked up a sharp tool and made a set of careful marks that served no purpose beyond simply existing. That impulse, whatever you want to call it, feels remarkably familiar even across this much time. So here is a question worth carrying with you as we keep going tonight. If an entire ancient population really did stretch once along this coastline sharing a single deep route before slowly splintering into these isolated, self-contained little worlds, what do you imagine finally pulled them apart? Was it the landscape itself, mountains and rivers slowly carving connected territory into disconnected pockets, or something quieter, some small cultural drift repeated across enough generations that eventually made each little community feel like the entire world on its own? I lean toward the quieter explanation myself for whatever that is worth. Mountains and rivers have separated human populations before without ever fully severing them. People find ways around water, around stone, around whatever the landscape puts in front of them when the pull toward the other side is strong enough. What seems to have been missing here was never the physical route. It was the pull itself, the specific, restless curiosity that sends one group of people walking toward another simply to see what they might find there. Whatever built that impulse so deeply into our own species, it does not appear to have taken root nearly as firmly in theirs, because there is one more piece of this particular puzzle we've not touched yet, and it involves the very same valley where Thorin himself was eventually found. Long before his own community ever settled there, and periodically afterward as well, that valley belonged, if only briefly, to people who are not Neanderthals at all. And figuring out whether those two very different kinds of people ever truly crossed paths turns out to be one of the more delicate, more honestly uncertain questions in this entire story. Let's zoom out from that one cave for a moment, because the question we ended on deserves a much wider map to answer properly. Inside Grotta Mandrin itself, the closest these two kinds of people ever came to directly overlapping was somewhere around 6 months at the very outside edge of what the evidence can support. A near miss in one particular valley at one particular moment in time. But that is only one small window looking out onto an enormous continent, and continents, unlike single caves, rarely tell just one story. So, let me widen the question considerably. Setting that one cave aside entirely, did Neanderthals and early modern humans ever actually meet anywhere in any meaningful sense? And if they did, what came of it? For a long time, the honest scientific answer to that question was a fairly uncertain shrug. Early studies comparing ancient genetic material found only faint disputed hints of contact, easy to dismiss as noise or error. It took years of steadily improving laboratory technique and a great deal of patient, unglamorous comparison across dozens of separate ancient genomes before researchers could finally say something with real confidence. The honest answer, thanks to a pair of remarkable studies published only recently, is that they met a great deal more than most people ever imagine. Not a single awkward, fleeting encounter somewhere in a forest. Something closer to a long-sustained relationship stretched across roughly 7,000 years, beginning somewhere around 50,500 years ago and continuing for millennia afterward. To reach that figure, researchers compared dozens of ancient human genomes recovered from across Europe and Western Asia against the genetic material of hundreds of present-day people from around the world, searching for the telltale fingerprints of Neanderthal ancestry, and carefully measuring how those fingerprints had gradually shifted and shortened across many thousands of years. Genetic material inherited from a distant ancestor breaks apart a little more with each new generation, the way a photocopy of a photocopy slowly loses its sharpness. By measuring exactly how blurred those particular fingerprints had become in different ancient individuals, researchers could work backward and pin down with real precision when the original mixing must have actually taken place. Let that sink in for a moment, because 7,000 years is not a chance meeting. 7,000 years is longer than the entire history of most civilizations most of us learned about in school. Generation after generation in various pockets scattered across the region we now call the Middle East and Eastern Europe Neanderthals, and early modern humans appear to have settled near enough and interacted often enough to have children together repeatedly across an enormous stretch of time. Here is where this story reaches directly into your own body wherever you happen to be sitting right now. If your ancestry traces outside of Africa somewhere in your own genetic material, quietly folded into every cell in your body sits a small inheritance from that exact period. Researchers estimate the figure at somewhere between 1 and 2% of the entire genome for most people whose ancestors eventually settled outside the African continent. Not a rounding error, not a curiosity buried in a footnote. A real, measurable, ongoing genetic thread connecting you right now to a species most of us grew up picturing as an entirely separate, entirely vanished branch of the human story. One of the researchers behind this recent work put it plainly, and I think it deserves repeating in its own right. The differences we tend to imagine between Neanderthals and ourselves, she noted, were actually far smaller than most people assume. Genetically speaking, we were considerably more alike than different. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it quietly reframes everything we have discussed so far tonight. We have spent a great deal of time this evening talking about isolation, about walls that apparently never came down, about two kinds of people who somehow managed to avoid each other almost entirely across 50,000 years in one particular valley. And all of that remains true. But it was never the whole picture, because elsewhere in other valleys along other coastlines that same wall came down constantly, repeatedly, for thousands of years, producing children, families, and eventually an inheritance carried forward into essentially every non-African person alive today. Two entirely different endings happening at the same time to the same species, depending entirely on which particular Neanderthal community you happen to be asking about. Now, this mixing was not without cost, and I think the details here are truly fascinating rather than simply a footnote. When researchers map out exactly where Neanderthal genetic material still shows up across the modern human genome, they find something curious. Certain stretches contain almost none of it at all, wide, conspicuously empty regions researchers have started calling genetic deserts. The likeliest explanation is not that Neanderthal ancestry never reached those particular stretches. It is that whenever it did generations ago, the resulting combination proved harmful enough that natural selection quietly filtered it back out over time, one difficult pregnancy or one shortened life at a time until those specific regions were left almost entirely clear. But elsewhere, the inheritance stuck around because it was useful. Certain genetic contributions traced back to Neanderthal ancestry appear to have helped early modern humans adapt more effectively to conditions outside Africa, aspects of immune response better suited to unfamiliar diseases, adjustments to skin that suited climates far dimmer and colder than the one our species had evolved under for hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers have also traced Neanderthal ancestry to genetic variants influencing how efficiently blood clots, how certain people metabolize fat during long cold winters, and even subtle differences in how some people experience and process pain. None of these traits announce themselves. Nobody walks around aware that a headache, a blood test result, or a tendency to bruise easily traces back to a Neanderthal ancestor who existed tens of thousands of years ago. But there it sits anyway, quietly doing its work, in millions of bodies that will never know its origin. In other words, some fairly practical part of what allowed our own ancestors to successfully settle unfamiliar corners of the planet may have come quite literally from the very people popular imagination has spent a century picturing as an evolutionary dead end. So let me ask you honestly, because I think this deserves a real answer rather than a rhetorical shrug. Does it change anything for you, hearing that the story is not simply about one species replacing another cleanly and completely, but about two populations blending together enough that millions of people today are quietly walking around with a small working piece of Neanderthal biology, helping keep them alive? Here finally is where Thorin's own story earns one more layer of strangeness, because across this entire 7,000-year window of mixing spanning multiple regions, and clearly touching a wide range of different Neanderthal communities, Thorin's own genetic material shows no trace of it whatsoever. None. His lineage, already isolated from other Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years, appears to have remained just as isolated from this particular chapter of history as well. While other Neanderthal populations were quietly folding themselves into the ancestry of nearly every person alive outside Africa today, Thorin's own community seems to have missed that door completely too. the same way it apparently missed every other door available to it. Which brings us honestly and carefully to the harder question underneath all of this. If interbreeding absorbed a meaningful portion of the Neanderthal population into our own species, rather than simply ending them outright, then what actually happened to the communities like Thorin's that never took that path at all? What actually killed off the branches that stayed separate? Researchers do not agree on a single tidy answer, and I want to be honest with you about that rather than pretend otherwise. A handful of competing explanations currently sit on the table, and the evidence increasingly suggests more than one of them was likely true at once in different places for different communities. Rather than one single cause explaining everything everywhere, climate sits near the top of most lists. Around 40,000 years ago, Europe experienced an unusually severe cold spell, part of a recurring pattern of abrupt climate swings that repeatedly reshaped the continent throughout this era. For a species already thinly spread, already struggling in small isolated pockets, the way we've discussed at length tonight, even a temporary collapse in available game or usable shelter could have proven decisive. Around roughly the same window, an enormous volcanic eruption tore open the ground near modern-day Naples, one of the largest eruptions Europe experienced in the last 200,000 years, spreading ash and sulfur across an enormous stretch of the continent and measurably cooling the climate for a period afterward. For years, some researchers treated this eruption as something akin to a smoking gun, a single dramatic event finally explaining a slow-motion tragedy that had otherwise resisted easy explanation. More recent, more careful climate modelling has complicated that tidy story considerably. Neanderthal populations in several regions were already declining well before the eruption occurred, and the temperature drop the eruption actually caused appears to have been survivable on its own, based on comparison with earlier cold periods Neanderthals had already endured successfully. The volcano, in other words, was very likely a serious blow landing on a population already weakened by other pressures, rather than the single cause of the whole story. My own honest take, for whatever it happens to be worth, is that the search for one single explanation was probably always going to disappoint us. Small fragmented populations thinned out by climate stress, occasionally struck by genuine catastrophe, competing in places for the same limited resources as an expanding well-networked new arrival, while other pockets of the same species quietly folded into that arrival through generations of shared families instead. None of that requires a single dramatic villain. It requires only the accumulation of many separate disadvantages landing hardest on the communities least equipped for whatever reason to adapt or reach outward when the pressure finally arrived. There is one more piece worth adding here, quieter than climate or catastrophe, but perhaps just as important: simple demographic weight. Best estimates suggest Neanderthal populations across the entire continent, even at their healthiest, likely never numbered more than a few tens of thousands of individuals scattered across an enormous territory. Early modern human populations, arriving in growing waves, appear to have expanded considerably faster, once established, aided by exactly the kind of wide, interconnected social networks we spent considerable time discussing earlier tonight. A species that trades, that shares resources across distant communities during hard seasons, that maintains contact with dozens of neighbouring groups instead of a handful, simply has more room to absorb a bad year without collapsing entirely. Over enough centuries, that kind of structural resilience adds up to something very near an unstoppable advantage, even without a single dramatic confrontation ever taking place. And that more than anything else is what makes Thorin's particular branch of this story land so differently than the rest of it. Some Neanderthal communities continue on today quietly inside the genetic material of people, who have absolutely no idea they're carrying it. Thorin's community does not appear to. As far as the evidence currently shows, his entire lineage simply ended, leaving behind no descendants, no genetic footprint in any living person, nothing but a single set of teeth and a jawbone waiting patiently in the dirt for 9,000 generations until one persistent archaeologist finally came looking. I keep returning to that particular asymmetry, and I'm not sure I've fully made peace with it yet. Some ways of being human, it turns out, quietly continue on inside all of us, unnoticed, folded into eye colour, immune response, the shape of an inherited habit nobody can trace back to its source. Others simply stop completely, leaving nothing behind except the kind of silence that takes 9 years, an international team of scientists, and a great deal of patient stubbornness to even partially hear again. There is no tidy moral waiting at the bottom of that comparison, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just to give you a neater ending. Survival on the scale we're discussing tonight was never fair, and it was never entirely earned either. Some populations reached outward at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place, and quietly folded themselves into everyone who came after. Others, through some combination of geography, habit, and simple chance, never got that same opportunity, and vanished as completely as a person can vanish, leaving behind nothing but bone and stone, and the patience of one archaeologist willing to spend 2 decades listening for them. Before we wrap up this particular thread of the story, there is one larger question worth carrying forward with us. If some branches of an entire species can vanish this completely, leaving no trace in anyone alive today, while other branches of that same species are still quietly shaping who we are this very moment, what does that actually tell us about what survival as a concept really means? Is a population truly gone once its last member dies, or does something of it persist as long as any piece of it continues on somewhere else, folded into a story it never got to witness for itself? That question, more than any single number or date we have covered tonight, is where this entire journey is ultimately headed next. Before we go any further, I want to show you a photograph that does not exist, or rather, one that exists everywhere in nearly every textbook, every cartoon, every lazy punchline about cavemen dragging women by the hair, and yet somehow manages to be almost entirely wrong. Picture the classic Neanderthal silhouette. Hunched shoulders, bent knees, head jutting forward like something still only halfway finished becoming human. That image has haunted popular imagination for more than a century now, and it comes from one single skeleton reconstructed by one single scientist, working from one deeply flawed assumption he never bothered to fully question. I want you to notice something before we even get to the science. Nearly everything this channel has spent the last several hours carefully unpacking about Thorin required patient excavation, careful laboratory work, years of cautious peer review before anyone dared publish a firm conclusion. And yet this other image, the hunched, grunting caveman silhouette spread across the entire world within a matter of years, required no verification whatsoever, and somehow still outlasted a century of better evidence. It is worth asking honestly why the wrong story so often travels faster and further than the careful one. In 1908, 3 French priests digging in a cave near a village called La Chapelle-aux-Saints uncovered the remains of an elderly Neanderthal man remarkably complete for his age. A paleontologist named Marcelin Boule took charge of reconstructing the skeleton a few years later, and the figure he presented to the world was stooped ape-like, dragging its knuckles towards something closer to a chimpanzee than a person. That single reconstruction, published in 1911, became the template. Every illustration, every museum diorama, every comic strip caveman for the next several decades traced its posture back to Boule's version of this one specific man. Here is the detail Boule either missed or more likely quietly chose not to examine too carefully. The skeleton he was working from belonged to someone who had survived deep into old age, and who suffered from severe arthritis throughout his spine and joints. When researchers finally re-examined those bones properly decades later, this slouch essentially disappeared. Remove the arthritis, and what remains is a spine, a hip, a set of legs built to stand every bit as upright as yours or mine. Boole, it turns out, was not simply making an honest mistake. He held a personal conviction going in that Neanderthals could not possibly be directly related to modern humans, and his reconstruction quietly bent the evidence to match a conclusion he had already decided on beforehand. I want to sit with that for a second because I think it says something important about how easily a single flawed assumption can calcify into common knowledge repeated so many times that nobody thinks to question it anymore. An entire century of hunched, grunting, knuckle-dragging caveman jokes built on the arthritic spine of one particular elderly man whose actual story turns out to be considerably more moving than the caricature that replaced it. Because here is what that same skeleton also quietly tells us once you stop looking at the posture and start looking at the teeth. This man had lost nearly all of them by the time he died. His jawbone shows clear signs that several teeth had fallen out or been lost long before death, with the surrounding bone partially healed over around the empty sockets, which means for years, possibly for the better part of a decade, this man could not have chewed tough meat or hard roots on his own. Somebody was almost certainly softening his food for him. Somebody was sharing their own hard-won resources with a person who could no longer fully contribute to gathering them himself. Think about what that actually required, practically speaking, in a world with no hospitals, no soft food processors, no guarantee of surplus food during a hard season. Someone had to notice this man's teeth failing, adjust what they brought back for him, perhaps chew or mash food themselves before offering it to him season after season for years on end, with absolutely nothing to gain from the arrangement beyond whatever value they placed on keeping him alive and present among them. That is not instinct. That is not simple survival math. That is a deliberate, sustained choice repeated daily by people who apparently decided this particular elderly man was worth the trouble. That is not the biography of a brute. That is the biography of someone whose community valued him enough for reasons we will never fully know to keep him alive and fed well past the point where his body alone could have managed it. I think about that a great deal more than I think about the hunched posture everyone got wrong for a century. So let me ask you something honestly before we go further tonight. When you pictured a Neanderthal before this story started, what image came to mind? Be honest with yourself for a second. I suspect for most of us it was something closer to Boole's mistaken sketch than to an elderly man being quietly cared for by people who loved him. Popular imagination has a way of holding on to the version of a story that requires the least effort to believe even years after the actual evidence has moved on without it. We've had a full century of cartoon cavemen grunting single syllables and dragging clubs behind them, and somehow not one of those cartoons ever paused to ask who was mashing up dinner for Grandpa back at the cave. Here is where I think this entire evening story actually starts pulling itself together into something larger than any single fact we have covered so far. Because what we have spent hours unpacking tonight is not really one story about one man. It is a story about how flattened, how oversimplified our entire picture of an entire species has been for most of the last century. We tend to imagine Neanderthals as a single uniform kind of people. One look, one lifestyle, one slow, fade toward extinction, playing out the same way across an entire continent. Thorin's community alone should have already put that idea to rest. A population stubbornly holding on to the same tool-making tradition for 10,000 unbroken years, sealed off from neighbours near enough to reach on foot within days, carrying genetic material that looked eerily like it belonged to a chapter of history that had technically already ended, and yet barely 1,000 kilometers south along the coast at Gibraltar, an entirely different Neanderthal community was living out its own version of permanence, tending the same hearth for 8,000 years, weathering ice ages the rest of the continent could not survive in a warm coastal refuge that let an old familiar rhythm continue on almost undisturbed. And elsewhere, still in other valleys along other frontiers, other Neanderthal communities were doing something neither of those groups managed: reaching outward. Meeting the earliest waves of modern humans arriving from Africa again and again for something near 7,000 sustained years, leaving behind children, families, and eventually a small but permanent genetic thread running through nearly every person alive today whose ancestry traces outside that continent. 3 entirely different stories, 3 entirely different endings, all happening more or less at the same time to branches of the exact same species. Slimak, the researcher who first pulled Thorin out of that valley in southern France, has spent considerable time thinking about exactly this kind of variation, and he has landed on a phrase I find myself returning to more than almost anything else in this entire story. He describes each of these isolated, distinct communities not simply as separate populations, but as separate ways of being human, each one carrying its own particular relationship to strangers, to tradition, to change, to risk. Not one Neanderthal story, many. Think about what that actually means, practically, if you take it seriously rather than just nodding along. It means the entire species we casually lump together under one single name was never actually one thing at all. It means somewhere in the deep past being human already came in multiple competing versions long before our own species ever entered the picture. Some communities built wide, trusting networks stretching across enormous distances. Others built small, fiercely loyal worlds that never extended beyond a familiar valley. Some cared tenderly for their oldest, most vulnerable members, well past the point of practical usefulness. All of these were valid, functioning ways of surviving, as a person tested and refined across hundreds of thousands of years, right up until the specific historical moment when only one of those strategies turned out to have a future left in it. I think that idea deserves more weight than it usually gets because it quietly dismantles something most of us were taught without ever really questioning it. We tend to think of extinction as something that happens to an entire species, all at once, a single door shutting on an entire way of life in one dramatic final moment. Thorin's story suggests something far stranger, and honestly far sadder. Some doors shut slowly over tens of thousands of years, in isolated valleys nobody else ever thought to check on. Other doors never fully shut at all. They simply change shape, folding quietly into a different species, entirely surviving on, in a form none of the people living through it could have recognized as survival. Slimak has gone further still in some of his more recent writing, describing what happened to communities like Thorin's, using a word I did not expect to hear applied to an entire vanished population. He has suggested that at least some of this extinction resembles something closer to a slow, unintentional kind of suicide, not through violence or dramatic collapse, but through a repeated compounding refusal generation after generation to reach outward when reaching outward might have mattered most. I want to be careful with that word because I think it can easily be misunderstood, and because it is very clearly one researcher's interpretation rather than a settled scientific consensus. Nobody chose extinction consciously. No single Neanderthal woke up one morning and decided their community's isolation would eventually prove fatal. But there is something quietly devastating about the pattern. All the same, a repeated cultural habit harmless in any single generation that only reveals its true cost when you step back far enough to watch it play out across tens of thousands of years. Other researchers studying this same broad period would likely push back on such a loaded word, and I think their caution is fair. Plenty of factors sat entirely outside any single community's control climate shifts. Nobody could have predicted resource pressures that had nothing to do with anyone's willingness to make new friends. Calling an entire ancient population's disappearance a kind of suicide risks assigning blame to people who in every meaningful sense were simply living the only life they had ever known, using the only strategies their culture had ever handed down to them. I raise Slimac's framing not because I think it settles anything, but because it captures something true about the shape of the pattern, even if the word itself asks for more certainty than the evidence can fully support. Here is a question worth sitting with in the particular quiet of wherever you happen to be watching this tonight. If an entire way of being human can simply fade out of existence, not through catastrophe, but through the slow accumulation of small repeated choices about who to trust and who to keep at a distance, what does that suggest about the choices any of us are quietly making every day, without ever noticing we are making them at all? I do not ask that to be dramatic. I ask it because I think Thorin's story, more than almost anything else I have researched for this channel, refuses to stay comfortably in the past. It keeps reaching forward uncomfortably into questions about isolation, community, and trust that have very little to do with stone tools or ancient genetic material at all. There is something quietly humbling about spending an entire evening with a man who's been dead for roughly 42,000 years and coming away with more questions about your own life than you started with. I did not expect that when I first started researching this particular story, and I suspect if you have made it this far tonight, some version of that same feeling has settled over you as well. We have spent this entire evening building toward a scientific picture that felt by the end of it almost settled. A clear divergence date, a clear isolation number, a clear if unfinished portrait of who Thorin was, and how his particular branch of humanity came to such a quiet, complete end. Every piece fit together carefully, one careful season of digging, one careful year in a laboratory, one careful comparison against a growing library of ancient genetic material at a time, and then, only recently in a completely different country, a discovery emerged that threatened to quietly unravel a great deal of what we just spent this entire night carefully building together. The discovery happened of all places inside a modest limestone cave in southern Poland known to researchers as Stajnia Cave, roughly 1,000 kilometers northeast of the valley. We have spent this entire evening exploring together. A completely different country, a completely different research team, a completely different set of questions being asked by people who, as far as anyone can tell, were not even thinking about Thorin when they started this particular project. Picture the setting for a moment, because it could hardly look more different from the sun-bleached limestone gorge we started this evening inside. The cave sits in an upland region known locally for its dramatic karst landscape, jagged outcrops and hidden fissures carved slowly out of limestone bedrock over millions of years. Cold winters, dense forest pressing near the entrance. A landscape built for endurance rather than comfort, about as far removed from a warm Mediterranean coastline as this particular story could possibly take us. And yet somehow their work landed directly on top of everything we just spent hours carefully building. The research itself was carried out by an international team drawing on expertise from universities in Italy, and researchers at one of the world's leading centres for ancient genetic analysis in Germany. This kind of collaboration has become almost routine in this field by now, the same way we saw with Thorin's own case, different institutions, different specialties, all quietly converging on a handful of ancient teeth that most people walking past a museum case would never think twice about. The site itself has been quietly studied for years without producing much that made international headlines. That changed when this same research team working through material recovered from the cave sat down to properly analyse 9 ancient teeth pulled from its sediment. 8 of those teeth still held enough preserved genetic material to actually work with, and what came out of that analysis turned into one of the more remarkable snapshots of ancient family life that this particular field has ever managed to recover. Here is why that matters more than it might sound like at first. Most of what we know about Neanderthal genetic material comes from scattered, isolated individuals, one tooth here, one jawbone fragment there, each one representing a lone person, disconnected from any clear sense of who they actually existed alongside. Stania Cave offered something considerably rarer. Genetic material recovered from at least 7 separate individuals, all connected to roughly the same narrow slice of time, effectively a small community captured together in a single place, rather than a single person standing in for an entire population. And within that small group, researchers found something quietly moving. 2 of the teeth belonged to children, a third belonged to an adult. All 3 shared an identical maternal genetic lineage, the specific thread of genetic material passed down exclusively through mothers generation after generation, essentially unchanged. In plain terms, these 3 individuals were almost certainly immediate family. A parent perhaps, and 2 children, or an aunt and her sister's children, resting together in the same cave in the same rough slice of time, more than 100,000 years before anyone would ever excavate them. I find myself lingering on that detail longer than the headline-grabbing science surrounding it. Somewhere in that cave a family once sheltered together, and something of that closeness survived quietly in a strand of genetic material too small to see waiting patiently across an almost unthinkable stretch of time for someone to finally notice it was there. Now, dating material this old is its own particular challenge, and it is worth understanding briefly how researchers approached it here, because the method itself becomes important to the twist, waiting just ahead of us. Rather than relying on radiocarbon dating, which becomes increasingly unreliable, the further back in time you push it, researchers used a technique sometimes called molecular dating. Genetic material accumulates small mutations at a fairly steady, predictable pace across generations, almost like a slow, quiet clock ticking forward inside every strand of it. By counting how many of these small changes had built up in the Stania material, and comparing that count against other genetic material whose age is already firmly established, researchers were able to estimate how long ago these particular individuals had actually existed. Their answer placed the Stania group within a broad window running from roughly 130,000 years ago to 71,000 years ago, with the most likely estimate landing somewhere near 100,000 years in the past, which would make this small Polish family considerably older than almost anything else we've discussed together tonight, older even than the deep split researchers identified in Thorin's own ancestry. Here is where the story I promised you actually begins. When researchers compared this newly recovered maternal lineage against the wider catalogue of previously studied Neanderthal genetic material, they found it was not unique to Poland at all. The same specific maternal thread turned up in individuals recovered from the Iberian Peninsula from southeastern France and from the Caucasus Mountains far to the east, suggesting this particular lineage had once been remarkably widespread, stretching across an enormous swathe of Western Eurasia, before eventually being pushed aside by other maternal lines more common among later Neanderthal populations. And then tucked into that same wide-ranging comparison, researchers noticed something that must have made more than one person in that laboratory sit up a little straighter in their chair. Thorin's own maternal genetic lineage, the one recovered from that single molar in Grotta Mandrin, falls on the exact same branch as the Stajnia family, Not a distant cousin branch, not a loose regional similarity. The same specific maternal thread connecting a small family sheltering in a Polish cave roughly 100,000 years ago to a solitary man found dying in a French valley, supposedly 42 to 50,000 years later. Sit with that contradiction for a moment because it deserves real weight rather than a quick nod before moving on. Every method used to date Thorin's own remains the position of his bones within the cave sediment radiocarbon measurements taken from nearby material, several independent lines of archaeological evidence layered on top of one another, all pointed toward a relatively late date somewhere between 50,000 and 42,000 years ago. And yet his closest known maternal relative belongs to a lineage that molecular dating places roughly 100,000 years in the past, a lineage that, as far as current evidence shows, essentially disappears from the genetic record afterward, replaced by newer maternal lines across most of the continent. How does a man supposedly living 42,000 years ago end up carrying a maternal lineage that seems to have effectively vanished everywhere else, 50,000 years before he was even born? Researchers studying this puzzle have offered two very different ways of resolving it, and I think both deserve your honest attention because neither one is obviously correct yet. The first possibility keeps everything we discussed earlier tonight fully intact and simply adds another remarkable layer on top of it. Perhaps Thorin's community really was exactly as isolated as his broader genetic material already suggested, so completely cut off from the rest of the Neanderthal world that his maternal lineage simply never updated, never replaced itself with newer variants the way it did almost everywhere else. A kind of genetic time capsule carrying a maternal thread that had effectively gone extinct everywhere else on the continent, quietly persisting in one hidden valley for tens of thousands of years after its apparent expiration date elsewhere. Researchers who considered this option gave it an almost literary name of its own, describing it as a ghost population, a lineage technically still walking around long after the rest of the world had already moved past it. Think about what that would actually mean practically if it turned out to be true. Somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, this particular maternal lineage was apparently common enough to show up in Poland, in Spain, in France, in the mountains of the Caucasus. And then gradually almost everywhere else it simply stopped appearing in the record, quietly overtaken by newer maternal lines carried by more mobile, more widely connected populations. Except perhaps in one small forgotten corner of the Rhone Valley, where nobody new ever arrived to replace it, and the old thread simply kept being passed down mother to daughter, largely unchanged for another 50,000 years after everyone else had already moved on without it. The second possibility is less romantic and considerably more uncomfortable for anyone who has grown attached to the tidy timeline we spent all evening constructing together. Perhaps Thorin himself is simply older than we have been assuming, considerably older. The team behind the Steinia research has pointed out with real technical precision that radiocarbon dating becomes shaky exactly in the range Thorin's remains fall into near enough to the outer limit of what the method can reliably measure that the margin of error grows uncomfortably wide. Radiocarbon dating works by measuring how much of a specific radioactive form of carbon has decayed inside organic material since the moment an organism died. It is remarkably precise for anything younger than roughly 50,000 years. Past that point, so little of the original radioactive material remains that separating a genuine signal from ordinary background noise becomes extraordinarily difficult, the scientific equivalent of trying to hear a single whispered word from the very back row of a crowded, noisy hall. Thorin's proposed age sits almost exactly at that difficult threshold, near enough to the edge that some researchers now argue the original measurement may never have been reliable enough to support the precise date everyone, myself included, has been comfortably repeating throughout this entire evening. Push a sample too near that boundary, and the resulting date can end up resting on statistical noise rather than solid ground, confident-sounding numbers built on considerably less certainty than they appear to carry. One of the senior researchers on the Steiner study put it plainly, and I think her caution deserves to be heard clearly rather than smoothed over. She has said that the oldest chronologies in this field need to be treated with real caution, and that once radiocarbon measurements start approaching the outer edge of what the method can reliably support, researchers have a responsibility not to present more precision than the underlying data can actually justify. I want to be honest with you about how strange it feels to sit with that possibility after everything we have covered tonight. If Thorin truly turns out to be nearer to 100,000 years old, rather than 42,000 entire pieces of the story we carefully built together this evening would need to be quietly redrawn. Not erased necessarily. The isolation would likely still be real. The cultural conservatism, the stubborn stone tools, the small, tightly related community, none of that evidence disappears simply because the calendar underneath it might need adjusting. But the specific shape of his story, exactly when he existed, exactly how his life lined up against the modern humans, occasionally passing through that same valley, would shift considerably, and some of the emotional weight we have placed on him being one of the very last Neanderthals anywhere would need to be reconsidered rather carefully. I will admit there is something almost fitting about a story this patient ending its evening with more uncertainty rather than less. We spent hours together tonight slowly assembling what felt by the end of it like a remarkably complete picture. A name, a genome, a lineage, a cave with its own complicated history. And now at the very edge of that picture, a small family from Poland has quietly reached across 100,000 years and asked us to double-check our math. I think what strikes me most sitting with this particular twist is how ordinary the uncertainty actually is once you step back from the drama of it. This is not a story about scientists getting something wrong through carelessness. It is a story about the honest, unglamorous limits of the tools we currently have available, tools that are remarkably good at answering some questions and truly unreliable at answering others, particularly once you push them near the very edge of what they were ever designed to measure. Every field of science eventually runs into this same wall somewhere. The instruments improve, the models get sharper, and every so often a new piece of evidence arrives that forces careful people to go back and quietly rebuild a small section of a story they thought had already been finished. So let me ask you honestly, because I think it is worth sitting with before we go any further tonight. Does a discovery like this frustrate you the way it does me a little, or does it make the whole story feel more alive, more honest, precisely because it refuses to sit still and let itself be fully solved? Because that question, more than any single date we could argue over, is exactly where this story needs to end up next. Not with a tidy answer, but with an honest look at how confident we can actually afford to be about numbers this old, and what it might take to finally settle whether Thorin belongs to a ghost or simply to a clock that has been quietly running slower than anyone realized. To understand exactly how shaky that ground really is, it helps to understand what radiocarbon dating is actually measuring in the first place, because I think the mechanics themselves explain the uncertainty better than any single expert quote could. Every living thing on this planet absorbs a tiny, steady trace of a particular radioactive form of carbon throughout its life, simply by breathing, eating, existing. The moment an organism dies, that absorption stops, and the radioactive carbon already inside it begins slowly, predictably decaying away, cut in half, roughly every 5,700 years. Measure how much of that original radioactive carbon still remains in an ancient bone or tooth, and you can calculate with real precision how long ago that organism died. It is in its own quiet way one of the more elegant tools modern science has ever handed to people, trying to understand the deep past a natural stopwatch built directly into the chemistry of every living thing. For most of human history, this works beautifully. But carbon, unlike some more exotic isotopes, decays relatively quickly, which means the method has a hard physical ceiling built into it. Past roughly 50,000 years, so little of the original radioactive material remains that separating an honest signal from ordinary background static becomes extraordinarily difficult, sometimes near impossible. And the nearer a sample sits to that ceiling, the more devastating even a tiny amount of contamination becomes. A sample that is truly 40,000 years old, accidentally contaminated with only 1% modern carbon during excavation, handling or storage, can measure several thousand years younger than its true age, an error large enough to completely reshape a story like the one we've spent this entire evening building. There is a second layer of complication sitting underneath all of that. One most people outside this particular field have never had reason to think about. Raw radiocarbon measurements are not actually calendar dates. The amount of radioactive carbon naturally present in the atmosphere has never stayed perfectly constant. It rises and falls gently across the centuries, shaped by shifts in solar activity and the strength of the planet's own magnetic field. Scientists correct for this using something called a calibration curve, built painstakingly from thousands of samples whose true age is already known through completely independent means. Tree rings counted one growth season at a time, ancient coral layers dated through entirely different radioactive processes. Picture what that actually involves for a moment. Somewhere a researcher is counting individual growth rings inside a piece of ancient wood. One ring for every single year that tree quietly stood somewhere on Earth, sometimes stretching that count back across thousands of overlapping samples just to build one small trustworthy segment of the curve. That is the standard every radiocarbon date ultimately gets measured against, a painstaking, almost obsessive kind of bookkeeping, stretching back through recorded time. It works remarkably well for the last 12,000 years or so, where tree ring records remain thick and continuous. Push further back than that, and the available anchor points those independently dated samples. Researchers can check their work against grow considerably sparser. That calibration curve grows steadily less certain the further back in time it has to stretch, and right around the same 50,000 year mark where Thorin's own dating sits, the available reference points thin out considerably, leaving researchers working with noticeably wider margins of honest uncertainty than most headlines ever bother to mention. None of this means Thorin's original dating was careless or poorly done. To be fair to everyone involved in that earlier research, his age was never based on a single radiocarbon measurement standing alone. Researchers combined his position within the cave's layered sediment measurements taken from animal remains found near his body, and multiple independent dating techniques applied across the surrounding archaeological layers, cross-checking one method against another rather than trusting any single number in isolation. That kind of layered, cautious approach is exactly what responsible science is supposed to look like, and it is worth remembering that even careful, responsible science can still land near enough to a truly difficult boundary that new evidence arriving years later from an entirely different country can reasonably ask everyone involved to take a second, more careful look. That, I think, is the real headline hiding underneath all of tonight's numbers. Not that anyone was wrong, simply that certainty in a field working this near the outer edge of what our instruments can actually measure was always going to be more fragile than it looked from the outside. One of the researchers behind the Stajnia finding said something that has stayed with me since I first came across it, and I want to leave it with you clearly in its own right, rather than folding it quietly into a paragraph about something else. She said that the very oldest chronologies in this field deserve to be treated with real deliberate caution, and that once a measurement approaches the outer limit of what its method can honestly support, researchers owe it to the evidence not to hand the rest of us more precision than the data actually earned. I think that sentence deserves to sit here on its own for a moment, because it applies to far more than radiocarbon dating if you let it. Most of us at some point hold on to a number, a story, a version of events we've repeated so many times, it starts to feel unquestionably solid, simply because nobody has challenged it recently. Thorin's story is a quiet reminder that even our most carefully built pictures of the past remain provisional, waiting patiently for the next honest piece of evidence, willing to ask an uncomfortable question. So where does that actually leave us tonight at the end of everything we have covered together? Honestly, it leaves us here, undecided in the most productive sense of that word. Researchers on both sides of this particular question are continuing to work the problem, carefully refining calibration methods, searching for additional Mediterranean specimens whose genetic material might finally settle the timeline one way or the other, comparing Thorin's remains against an ever-growing catalogue of ancient genetic material gathered from across the continent. Some are quietly hoping to recover nuclear genetic material, not just the maternal thread we've spent tonight discussing from other individuals connected to that same widespread lineage, hoping a fuller genetic picture might finally break the tie between these two competing explanations. Others are pushing to refine the calibration curve itself further, still chasing down new tree ring sequences and coral samples, old enough to finally narrow some of the gaps sitting right around Thorin's own difficult range. Somewhere in a laboratory right now, possibly in Toulouse, possibly in Copenhagen, possibly in a city we have not even mentioned tonight, someone is quietly working toward the next piece of this particular puzzle. The same patient, unglamorous way every piece of tonight's story eventually came together in the first place. I do not know, sitting here with you right now, whether Thorin turns out to be a genuine ghost, a lineage that somehow outlived its own apparent expiration date by 50,000 years, or simply a man whose true age has been quietly waiting this whole time for our instruments to finally catch up with him. I suspect, honestly, we will not know for certain for several more years yet, and I find myself surprisingly at peace with that uncertainty, rather than frustrated by it. There is a particular kind of comfort I have come to realize in accepting that a story can remain truly open while still being completely worth telling. We're conditioned, most of us, to want our stories finished, wrapped up, safely filed away, with a confident conclusion attached. Real history rarely cooperates with that instinct. It keeps handing us fragments, revising its own footnotes, occasionally reaching back across 100,000 years to quietly correct something we thought we already understood. I have come to think that is not a flaw in how history works. It might be the entire point. Let's step back together for just a moment before we wrap this particular story up for the night. We began this evening with a broken jawbone surfacing quietly from the dirt of a French hillside, in the hands of a man who'd already spent most of his career convinced something was hiding there, waiting to be proven right. We followed that fragment through a cave old enough to have hosted two entirely different kinds of people, sometimes only months apart from one another. We watched a small, stubborn community hold on to the exact same way of shaping stone for 10,000 unbroken years and traced a single strand of genetic material, stretching improbably from that quiet French valley all the way to a rock overlooking the coast of Africa. We borrowed a name from a story about dwarves and mountains and stubborn tragic pride and found it fit rather better than any of us probably expected going in. We sat with the strange arithmetic of an entire community that stayed 50,000 years apart from its nearest relatives, while somehow living near enough to reach them within a single autumn's walk. And then right at the very end, just when the whole picture finally felt complete, a small family from Poland reached across 100,000 years and asked us gently but firmly to stay a little more humble about exactly how much we actually know. Along the way, I hope you picked up more than a timeline. I hope some part of tonight's story quietly followed you past the science itself into something a little more personal. A reminder that entire ways of living, entire habits of trust and distance, passed down without anyone consciously choosing them, can shape the fate of a whole community across tens of thousands of years without a single dramatic moment ever announcing it was happening. A reminder that the people we reduce to statistics and divergence dates once fed their elderly by hand, buried their dead with something resembling ceremony, and carved careful marks into stone for no reason beyond the simple human urge to leave something behind. I think that is precisely the kind of ending this particular story deserves. Not a tidy finish, not a clean, satisfying answer tucked neatly into the final few minutes. Something closer to the truth of how real discovery actually works. Patient, humbling, endlessly willing to be revised by whoever is willing to keep digging. Thank you honestly for spending this much of your evening here with me tonight. Stories like this one take a great deal of quiet, careful work to put together hours of reading through research papers most people will never open, cross-checking one source against another, trying to find the version of this story that respects both the science and the person it actually happened to. Having you here at the end of it, still listening, still curious, still willing to sit with a story that refuses to give you a completely tidy ending, means more than you probably realize. I think about Thorin sometimes, oddly enough, in moments that have nothing to do with research at all. Washing dishes, walking somewhere quiet. I find myself wondering in an unguarded way. I do not often let myself wonder about historical figures what his actual voice might have sounded like, what specific things frightened him, whether he ever stood at the edge of that valley on a clear night and looked toward the horizon the same way any of us might, without any way of knowing that people were living just days away near enough to matter too far to ever meet. We will never answer that question. But I have come to believe that sitting with it honestly, rather than rushing past it toward the next fact, is exactly the kind of attention his story deserves. If tonight's journey left you with a question, a theory of your own about Thorin, or simply a feeling you cannot quite put into words yet, I would love to hear it down in the comments. Tell me which part stayed with you longest. Tell me whether you land on the side of the ghost population or the miscalculated clock. This particular mystery is still being written quite literally by researchers who are not finished with it yet, and I fully intend to bring you back the moment the next real piece of this puzzle finally surfaces, whenever that turns out to be. If you found your way to the end of this one, and something in it settled into you the way these stories are meant to, consider staying nearby for whatever comes next. There are entire valleys, entire vanished communities, entire quiet mysteries, like this one, still waiting patiently in the dirt for someone to go looking. Until then, get some rest. Let the valley and the cave and the small stubborn family who once called it home settle quietly into your dreams tonight. There are more stories like this one waiting for us, and I would love nothing more than to have you here again when it is time to tell the next one. Sleep well,